Hey guys, tonight we're climbing into one of history's most terrifying contraptions, the medieval siege tower. Picture this, you're standing in a muddy field outside a fortified city, and looming before you is a wooden structure that's part skyscraper, part battering ram, part coffin. It's swaying slightly in the wind, creaking like your grandmother's attic stairs, and you're about to spend the next several hours inside it while people actively try to set you on fire. The tower reaches maybe 40, 50 feet into the air, taller than most buildings you've ever seen in your life, and it's rolling towards stone walls bristling with crossbowmen who've had weeks to prepare for this exact moment. You probably won't survive this, and honestly, the engineers who built this thing weren't exactly confident about their own odds either. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, drop a comment letting me know where you're watching from and what time it is for you right now. I love seeing how this channel connects people from Brisbane to Brooklyn, all winding down in their own time zones. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You're in France, let's say around 1304, though honestly this could be England, the Holy Land, or anywhere else Europeans decided to have a disagreement that required knocking down someone's walls. The siege tower before you has been under construction for 3 weeks, and you've watched it take shape from your position in the besieging army's camp. It started as a pile of timber oak mostly, because oak doesn't splinter as easily when a boulder hits it, and slowly transformed into this monstrosity that required 200 men just to move it into position. The tower sits on enormous wooden wheels, each one as tall as a man, and the whole structure is covered in fresh animal hides that glisten wetly in the morning sun. Those hides are soaked constantly, obsessively soaked, because the first thing defenders will try is setting this entire contraption ablaze. Someone's job, for the past 72 hours, has been walking around with buckets, making sure every square inch of cowhide stays dripping wet. That someone might be you tomorrow. If you survive today, lucky you. From where you stand, you can count at least 6 levels inside the tower, each one visible through gaps in the construction. The bottom level houses the wheel mechanism and the men who'll be pushing this beast forward. The middle levels are for archers and crossbowmen, your team's archers, theoretically providing covering fire, though covering fire is a generous term for men shooting blindly through arrow slits while trying not to fall over as the tower lurches across uneven ground. The top level, the platform everyone's really concerned about, is where the magic happens, or rather, where the horror happens, because that's where the drawbridge drops, and that's where you'll be expected to run screaming onto enemy battlements. You notice the tower isn't exactly vertical. There's a slight lean, maybe 5 degrees off, true, that everyone's pretending not to see. One of the engineers, a barrel-chested man from Burgundy who learned his trade building windmills, keeps walking around it with a plumb line, muttering calculations under his breath. He's rechecked his measurements 7 times this morning, and each time his frown has deepened. The lean is because the ground beneath the right wheels is softer than anticipated, probably because there's an underground spring feeding into the area. Medieval engineers didn't have ground-penetrating radar or soil surveys. They had sticks, string, and prayers. The city you're besieging, will call it Chateau Gallard, though its actual name doesn't matter because you'll never see the inside anyway. Sits on a hill. Not a dramatic mountain, just enough of an incline that your tower has to roll uphill for the last 100 yards. Someone calculated the angle and declared it manageable, which is military speak for probably fatal, but we're doing it anyway. The physics of moving a 40-foot wooden tower uphill while people shoot flaming arrows at it weren't exactly figured out with precision. Medieval mathematics could handle cathedral construction and astronomical calculations, but a siege tower on an incline? That was more of a let's try it and see who dies situation. You can smell the tower from here: wet leather, green timber that's not quite seasoned properly, and something else, something organic and wrong that you realize is the ox grease they've slathered on the wheel axles. They've used animal fat because it's plentiful and cheap, but in the summer heat it goes rancid quickly, attracting flies that now swarm the base of the tower in clouds. You'll be breathing that smell for hours, and it'll be the least of your problems. The historical record tells us that siege towers were used as early as the ancient Assyrians around 850 BCE, but they really hit their stride during the Crusades and the European medieval period. The tower before you represents centuries of refined engineering. Each disaster, each collapse, each burning failure contributed some small lesson that made this version theoretically less likely to kill everyone inside. Theoretically, the Romans had perfected siege towers to an art form, with towers at the Siege of Alesia in 52 BCE that ancient sources describe as technological marvels. But those Roman secrets were largely lost by your time, so you're essentially working with a greatest hits compilation of siege tower design, minus all the institutional knowledge that made Roman versions actually work. Here's something they don't tell you in the history books. Most siege towers never made it to the walls. Historians still argue whether medieval siege warfare was more about psychological warfare than actual effectiveness, and the siege tower sits right at the center of that debate. Some scholars point to the handful of successful tower assaults and declare them game changers. Others note that for every successful deployment, there were a dozen towers that collapsed, burned, or simply got stuck in the mud before accomplishing anything. You're standing here hoping you're part of a success story, but statistics aren't on your side. The commander is giving a speech now, something about honor and God and how today's assault will break the siege. You're not really listening because you're watching a team of men try to extract one of the wheels from a rut it's fallen into, and it's not going well. They've got ropes and pulleys and about 30 soldiers heaving in unison, and the wheel is maybe moving an inch at a time. This is the tower's trial run, just getting it from the construction area to the staging ground, and it's already a disaster. The actual assault is supposed to begin at dawn tomorrow. A quirky fact that might amuse you if you weren't about to die. Some siege towers were built with fighting platforms that rotated. A handful of ambitious engineers in the 13th century experimented with revolving top sections that would let archers fire in multiple directions without repositioning the entire tower. The mechanical complexity of building a rotating platform on top of a mobile wooden tower was, predictably, beyond medieval capabilities. Most of these experimental towers either locked up immediately or spun so freely that archers were thrown off the sides. One recorded attempt at the Siege of Acre in 1291 resulted in the entire rotating section detaching and crushing 12 men below. Innovation is great, but maybe not when you're already working with technology held together by rope and hope. You're assigned to the second-level archer support. They call it, though you're not an archer. You're barely trained with the short sword they've given you. Your job is to hand arrows to the actual archers, help reload crossbows, and generally try not to fall through one of the many gaps in the flooring. The floors aren't solid. They're more like platforms with spaces between the boards because solid floors would make the tower too heavy. You can look down through the gaps and see the level below, and below that, and below that, all the way to the ground level where men are already taking their positions at the pushing bars. The construction of this tower took every carpenter within 20 miles, all of them working under guard because desertion was a constant problem. Nobody wanted to build the thing that would later get them killed. The lead carpenter, an old Norman named Guillaume, has built 3 siege towers in his career. 2 of them burned before reaching the walls. The 3rd made it to the battlements, and Guillaume still has scars from the boiling oil that poured through the arrow slits. He's building this one because the alternative is execution for refusing a direct order. And he's hedged his bets by making sure he's essential personnel who'll be supervising from the rear during the actual assault. Your armor is a Jokia padded gambeson that might stop a glancing blow and a helmet that's dented on one side from its previous owner's final battle. The previous owner didn't survive to reclaim it, which tells you everything you need to know about your chances. The gambeson is soaked with someone else's sweat and probably blood, though the dark stains could be wine or mud or any number of fluids you'd rather not contemplate. It smells like wet dog and despair. The tower's drawbridge is the crucial element, and you can see it now, folded up against the front of the top level like a massive wooden shield. When the tower reaches the walls, if it reaches the walls, that bridge will drop onto the enemy battlements, creating a pathway exactly wide enough for 2 men to run across shoulder to shoulder. The bridge is reinforced with iron brackets and more of those wet hides, but everyone knows the moment it drops, it becomes a death funnel. Defenders will be packed at the opposite end with spears, swords, and absolutely no intention of letting you cross. Night falls, and you're ordered to sleep near the tower, ready for the dawn assault. Sleep, right? You lie on the ground, staring up at the tower's silhouette against the stars, and you can hear it settling, wood creaking, joints flexing, the whole structure breathing like a living thing. Somewhere on the 3rd level, something snaps, probably just a support beam adjusting to the weight distribution, but it sounds like a whip crack in the darkness. Nobody goes to investigate. If the tower's going to collapse, you'd rather not know about it until it happens. You think about the walls you're supposed to assault. Stone, 40 feet high, with crenellations that give defenders perfect cover while they rain death down on attackers. The walls have been there for 80 years, built by craftsmen who knew their work would be tested exactly like this. Your tower is 3 weeks old, built by conscripted carpenters working with green wood and impossible deadlines. It's a race between medieval engineering and medieval fortification, and you're the one caught in the middle. There's a mathematician attached to the siegesum scholar from Paris who calculated the tower's optimal approach angle and speed. He's never been in a battle, never seen a siege tower in action, but he's very confident about his numbers. His calculations suggest that if the tower moves at exactly the right speed, the defender's arrows will mostly miss due to the difficulty of leading a moving target. What his calculations don't account for is that the tower won't move at a consistent speed because the ground is uneven. The wheels are different sizes, and the men pushing it will be dying the entire time. Remember that lean we talked about earlier? It's worse now. The tower has settled overnight, and the right side has sunk another 2 inches into the soft ground. The engineer from Burgundy has given up pretending it's fixable. Instead, he's calculating whether the lean will cause the tower to tip over before or after it reaches the walls. His best guess is during, which at least means you won't have to face the defenders. You'll just be crushed under several tons of oak while still technically on your own side of the battlefield. There's a certain efficiency to that. The wet hides are being refreshed one final time. Teams of men with buckets form a line from the nearest stream, passing water hand to hand to soak every surface. The hides steam slightly in the cool morning air, and you realize that you're about to spend hours in what's essentially a mobile sauna that people are actively trying to set on fire. The combination of wet leather, human sweat, and fear is going to create an atmosphere inside that tower that would challenge a modern hazmat team. Dawn breaks, and someone shouts the order to board. This is it. You're about to climb into the rickety death box and begin your very short career as a siege tower operator. The ladder up to the second level is crowded 30 men trying to climb simultaneously because nobody wants to be last. But nobody wants to be first either. You're somewhere in the middle, which feels metaphorically appropriate for your entire existence. As you climb, you notice details you missed before. The rungs are unevenly spaced because they were added hastily, and some of them flex alarmingly under your weight. The interior smells worse than the exterior sawdust, sweat, and something that might be vomit from someone's nervous stomach. The arrow slits are narrow, barely wide enough to shoot through, and they let in thin blades of morning light that do nothing to illuminate the darkness inside. You reach your platform and take your position. The actual archers are already there, testing their bowstrings, checking their arrows. One of them is praying quietly, and you're not sure if that's comforting or terrifying. Below you, you hear the pushing team taking their positions, and above you, the assault team is loading onto the top platform, the poor bastards who'll be first across the drawbridge. The tower lurches forward, and your journey begins. The first thing you learn about your fellow tower occupants is that military hierarchy means absolutely nothing when everyone's probably going to die together. You're wedged onto the second platform with a collection of humanity that makes you wonder if the commander just pointed at random people and said, "You'll do." To your left is Jacques, a Flemish peasant who was plowing his field 3 months ago and now clutches a crossbow like it's a venomous snake he's been told to befriend. To your right is someone who insists his name is Sir Roderick of Champagne, though the fact that he's barefoot and his armor is literally just a cooking pot strapped to his chest suggests his noble lineage might be aspirational rather than actual. The conscription process that filled this tower was less selection of elite warriors and more grab everyone who can't run fast enough. Medieval armies didn't have the luxury of professional soldiers for every position, especially not for siege tower duty, which ranked somewhere between cleaning the latrines and testing the moat for depth by jumping in on the list of desirable military assignments. You were conscripted 6 weeks ago from your village, pulled away from your blacksmith apprenticeship because the Lord needed bodies and you had the misfortune of being young and healthy looking. Jacques keeps muttering a prayer in Flemish that you don't understand, but the desperate tone transcends language barriers. He's maybe 19, with hands that are still calloused from farm work rather than weapon training. Someone handed him a crossbow literally yesterday, and gave him approximately 30 minutes of instruction that boiled down to pointy end toward enemy. Crank this part to reload. Try not to shoot yourself. The crossbow itself is a mystery of engineering to him. The mechanical advantage of the windlass system, the tension calculations of the prod, the trajectory physics, all of it might as well be sorcery. He's figured out which end the bolt goes in, and that's about the extent of his expertise. Sir Roderick, meanwhile, won't shut up about his supposed noble heritage. According to his increasingly elaborate story, he's the third son of a count who fell on hard times, forced to join this siege to restore his family's honor. The story has holes you could drive a siege tower through, like why a count's son would be fighting in a common assault unit, or why his family crest appears to be carved into his cooking pot with what looks like a nail. But calling him out seems pointless when you're all about to die together, so you let him ramble about the chateau his family definitely owns in Champagne and the hunting dogs he definitely used to ride to hounds with. Behind you is Thomas, and Thomas is a problem. He's a convicted thief, pulled from a dungeon where he was awaiting execution for stealing a horse. The deal offered to him was simple: fight in the siege and possibly die, or definitely die in 3 days when they hang him. Thomas chose possible death, which seems rational until you realize that a man with nothing to lose in a confined space full of weapons is everyone's problem. He keeps fingering the short blade they've given him and eyeing the other men with an expression that suggests he's calculating whether killing a few tower mates and making a run for it might be better odds than facing the defenders. There's also Martin, who claims to be a veteran of 2 previous sieges, though when pressed for details he gets vague about which sieges those were and what his role entailed. You suspect his experience consisted of standing near sieges while doing supply work, but he's the closest thing to expertise you have, so everyone keeps looking to him for guidance he's clearly unqualified to provide. When Jacques asked him how to aim the crossbow, Martin's advice was point it at the wall and hope for the best, which is technically accurate but not particularly helpful. Historians still argue whether medieval armies were primarily composed of trained soldiers or conscripted peasants, and the answer seems to be yes. Professional men-at-arms existed, certainly knights and their retinues, mercenary companies, specialized troops like Genoese crossbowmen or Welsh longbowmen. But the bulk of medieval armies, especially for extended sieges, consisted of whatever bodies could be scraped together through feudal obligation, conscription, or desperation. Your tower contains the full spectrum: a handful of men who've held weapons before, and a majority who've held nothing more dangerous than farming implements. The assault team on the platform above you is slightly better equipped, but only slightly. You can hear them moving around the creak of leather, the clink of mail, someone sharpening a blade against a whetstone with long, nervous strokes. These are the men who'll actually cross onto the battlements first, and they've been chosen for this honor through a selection process you don't understand. Maybe they're braver, maybe they're more skilled, or maybe they just pissed off the wrong sergeant and this is their punishment. Medieval military organization wasn't exactly transparent about these things. One quirky detail about siege tower crews: they often included musicians. Not for morale, though that was the official reason, but because someone realized that coordinating the movements of hundreds of men inside a wooden box required better communication than shouting. Your tower has a drummer on the ground level whose job is to beat out rhythms that signal when to push, when to stop, when to brace for impact. He's a scrawny kid from Normandy who plays drums at his village church, and now he's responsible for keeping this entire operation synchronized. The rhythm he's beating now is slow and steady, the approach march tempo that's supposed to keep the pushing crew moving at a consistent pace. Later, if things go well, he'll switch to the assault rush, a faster beat that signals the final charge to the walls. If things go poorly, he'll probably be dead, and the tower's coordination will collapse into chaos. You're handed a bundle of arrows, your actual job for this nightmare expedition. 12 arrows, wrapped in cloth to keep the fletching intact, and you're supposed to pass them to the archers as needed. Simple enough, except the platform is already crowded. You're wearing a helmet that limits your peripheral vision, and in about 10 minutes everything is going to be on fire or in motion or both. The arrows themselves are a mixed lotsome with proper goose feather fletching, others with what looks like duck or even chicken feathers, and one that appears to have been fletched with someone's old hat. Medieval supply chains weren't exactly standardized, so you worked with whatever the Fletcher had available. Sir Roderick has started arguing with another conscript about platform space. Apparently, Roderick believes his noble status entitles him to a position closer to the arrow slit where he can observe the battlefield with proper tactical awareness. The other conscript, a pig farmer named Henri, believes Roderick is full of shit and should stand where he's told. The argument is escalating, with Roderick invoking his family honor and Henri invoking some very creative French profanity. And you're watching two men nearly come to blows in a space where everyone needs to cooperate to survive. Martin intervenes, not with authority but with exhaustion. "Save it for the defenders," he mutters, and something about his tone defeated, knowing shuts both men up. Henri and Roderick settle into a tense truce, standing shoulder to shoulder and radiating mutual contempt. You're reminded that most medieval battles probably featured as much internal conflict as external, especially in pressed units where loyalty was enforced at sword point rather than earned through camaraderie. The pushing crew below you starts their work, and the tower lurches forward with a groan that sounds like the oak itself is protesting. The movement is neither smooth nor straight. The tower rocks side to side, each will finding its own path across the uneven ground. On your platform, everyone automatically reaches for something to hold on to. Jacques grabs a support beam. Roderick catches himself on the edge of the arrow slit. You grab a rope that's hanging from the ceiling, and only after you're gripping it do you realize it's probably load-bearing for the structure above you, and your weight might be compromising something critical. You let go and brace against the wall instead. Through the arrow slit, you catch glimpses of the battlefield sliding past. The ground between your starting position and the walls is maybe 300 yards of absolute disaster waiting to happen. The defenders have prepared the approach beautifully dug hidden pits, scattered caltrops, set up obstacles at irregular intervals to slow or stop the tower. You can see some of the pits from here, poorly concealed divots in the earth where the covering branches have already collapsed. The tower's path has supposedly been scouted to avoid these traps, but supposedly is doing a lot of heavy lifting in that sentence. The crew on your platform includes two actual archers professionals, or as professional as you get in medieval warfare. One is a grizzled English longbowman named Edward, who looks like he's seen this exact scenario play out badly at least twice before. The other is a crossbowman from Genoa, part of a mercenary company that's been contracted for the siege. The Genoese barely speaks French. Edward barely speaks anything but English, and the rest of you are trying to coordinate with them through gestures and increasingly frantic pointing. There's a communication breakdown waiting to happen at exactly the worst moment. Edward is already knocking an arrow, testing the draw of his longbow in the confined space. The platform ceiling is maybe 7 feet high, not nearly enough clearance for a proper vertical draw, so he's had to adjust his technique to a more horizontal pull. This changes everything about his accuracy and power, and you can see the frustration on his face as he realizes the platform's design has essentially crippled his effectiveness. The longbow's advantage was its range and power, but in here he's reduced to shooting at awkward angles through narrow slits at targets he can barely see. He might as well be using a child's toy bow for all the good it'll do. The Genoese crossbowman has a different problem. His crossbow is a beautiful piece of equipment steel prod, windlass cranking mechanism, precision sights. It's also slow to reload, requiring him to brace the weapon with his foot and crank the windlass through several rotations to draw the string back. In open battle, crossbowmen worked in teams with shields for protection during the reload time. Here, he's alone, in a moving tower, trying to reload while standing on a platform that's swaying like a ship in a storm. He gets one shot, then becomes useless for the next 30 seconds while he cranks frantically to ready another bolt. Thomas the thief has edged closer to you, and you realize he's eyeing your arrows. Not because he needs them's not an archer, but because arrows have value, and Thomas's brain apparently can't stop calculating the worth of everything around him even when his life is at stake. "Those are good arrows," he says, nodding toward your bundle. "Proper fletching. Could sell those for a decent price in town." You're about to point out that there won't be a town to sell anything in if you don't survive the next hour. But Thomas probably knows that and is making conversation to distract himself from the fact that he's in a mobile coffin rolling toward people who want to kill him. Jacques has started crying quiet tears that he's trying to hide by facing the wall, but his shoulders are shaking and everyone can see. Nobody comments on it because, honestly, crying seems like a reasonable response to this situation. Sir Roderick looks like he wants to say something about cowardice unbecoming, but even he seems to recognize that whatever game he's playing with his fictional noble identity doesn't matter when you're all equally doomed. The tower hits something, a rock, a rut, maybe one of those concealed pits, and lurches violently to the left. Jacques is thrown against the wall, his crossbow clattering to the floor. Edward manages to keep his footing, but his arrow falls through a gap in the floorboards, and you watch it tumble down through the levels below until it disappears into the darkness of the ground floor. One arrow wasted, and you haven't even made contact with the enemy yet. The Genoese crossbowman isn't so lucky, thrown into Sir Roderick, and both men go down in a tangle of limbs and weapons and Roderick's ridiculous cooking pot armor. Martin helps them up with the weary efficiency of someone who's seen this chaos before. "Brace better," he advises, which is his solution to everything. "Can't shoot straight because the tower's moving? Brace better. Terrified you're about to die? Brace better." It's not helpful, but it's something to say, and in the absence of actual leadership, something is better than nothing. The tower rolls forward, and you're maybe 100 yards from the walls now, close enough to see individual defenders moving along the battlements. They're not panicking. They're not even hurrying particularly. They're just preparing, moving into position with the casual confidence of people who've done this before and know how it ends. One of them waves at your tower, actually waves, like he's greeting a neighbor, and you realize he's mocking you. He knows you're in here, knows you're probably terrified, and wants you to know that he's not. The interior of the siege tower greets you with darkness so complete that for the first 30 seconds, you're essentially blind. Your eyes were adjusted to dawn sunlight, and stepping through the entry into the tower's belly is like being swallowed. The only illumination comes from those narrow arrow slits, thin vertical cuts in the wooden walls that let in beams of light so narrow they might as well be decorative. These beams catch the dust and chaff floating through the air, creating pale shafts that do absolutely nothing to help you see where you're stepping, what you're holding, or whether that dark shape in the corner is a support beam or another terrified soldier. The smell hits you next, and it's a physical tina wall of odor so thick you can almost taste it. Wet cowhide dominates everything. That sour, organic reek of soaked leather that's been drying and re-wetting for days. Underneath that is fresh-cut wood, the sappy green smell of oak that hasn't properly seasoned, mixed with sawdust that gets into your throat and makes you cough. Then there's the sweat, dozens of men packed into enclosed spaces, most of them terrified, all of them exerting themselves, creating a humid fog of human fear that hangs in the air like a living thing. And beneath all of that, Almost hidden is the smell of rancid ox grease from the wheel axles below, a sweet, sick odor that reminds you of spoiled meat. The heat is worse than you expected, and the tower hasn't even started moving properly yet. Medieval siege towers were essentially wooden boxes sealed with animal hide, zero ventilation by design, because ventilation meant gaps, and gaps meant places for arrows and fire to enter. The morning sun is already warming the exterior, and the wet hides are beginning to steam, creating a sauna effect that makes the air thick and hard to breathe. Your gambeson, already uncomfortable, is now soaking up sweat at an alarming rate. You can feel moisture gathering at your lower back, under your arms, behind your knees. In another hour, you'll be completely drenched, and that's before any actual fighting begins. The platform beneath your feet is uneven, thick oak planks laid across support beams, but the planks don't quite meet flush. There are gaps between them, some as wide as your thumb, through which you can see down to the level below. You watch a soldier on the third level through one of these gaps. See him adjusting his position, and realize he can probably see you too. The entire tower is permeable this way, every level partially visible to every other level, which means panic on one floor will be immediately visible to everyone else. If the bottom level starts screaming, you'll know. If the top level catches fire, you'll watch it happen through the gaps above. Your shoulder presses against the wall, you can't help it. The platform is crowded and you feel the wall's construction through your armor. It's not solid wood. It's a lattice work of vertical and horizontal timbers with spaces filled by shorter planks, all of it designed to save weight while maintaining structural integrity. In theory, this makes the tower lighter and more mobile. In practice, it means the walls flex when you lean on them, bowing outward slightly in a way that makes you instantly doubt every engineering decision that went into this monstrosity. The wall creaks under your slight pressure, and you quickly shift your weight elsewhere. The support beams overhead are massive, probably 12 inches square, and they run the full width of the tower. Someone's carved notches into them at regular intervals, though you can't figure out why until you realize they're measuring marks. The engineers needed to ensure each level was the same height, so they marked the beams to guide construction. You can still see the carpenter's marks, Roman numerals chiseled into the wood. 3 for the third level, 4 for the fourth. It's a small detail, but it makes you think about the men who built this thing, working in some forest clearing with chisels and saws, knowing that their measurements would determine whether the tower stood or collapsed, whether dozens of men lived or died. A quirky historical detail: some medieval siege towers included internal wells, not for drinking water, but for firefighting. A few ambitious engineers in the 13th century designed towers with small water reservoirs on upper levels, connected by leather hoses to pumps below. The idea was that if the tower caught fire, crew members could fight the flames from inside without exposing themselves to enemy arrows. It never worked. The pumps were too weak. The hoses leaked constantly, and the water weight made the tower's top heavy and prone to tipping. One recorded attempt at the siege of Toulouse in 1218 resulted in the water reservoir bursting during transport, flooding the interior levels and drowning at least 3 men before the tower even reached the walls. Your tower has no such innovation, just buckets of water stationed at each level and the desperate hope that if fire breaks out, someone will be brave enough to use them. The ladder connecting your platform to the one above is less a ladder and more a suggestion of a ladder. The rungs are varying widths, some barely 3 inches wide. Others a proper six-nailed to vertical rails that themselves are attached to the wall with what looks like hope and twine. Every few rungs, someone's reinforced the connection with rope lashings, which means someone else noticed the ladder was failing and tried to fix it mid-construction. You're supposed to climb this thing while wearing armor and carrying weapons, possibly while the tower is moving or under fire or both. The rungs are already polished smooth from the boots of men climbing up and down during construction, which makes them slippery even when dry. Jacques is having a crisis about the darkness. He keeps moving toward the arrow slits, trying to get some light, some view of the outside world. But the slits are occupied by the actual archers who need them for shooting. Edward, the English longbowman, has claimed the best slit on your level, the one that faces directly toward the walls, and he's not moving for anyone. Each time Jacques edges closer, Edward shifts his body to block access without even looking at the Flemish peasant. A casual assertion of hierarchy that makes it clear who's essential personnel and who's just cargo. Jacques eventually retreats to the darkest corner of the platform, where he sits with his back against the wall, crossbow across his knees, probably wondering how his life led to this exact moment. The Genoese crossbowman has found a problem with his weapon. The windlass mechanism, the cranking device used to draw back the crossbow string, is catching on something. You watch him examine it in the dim light, running his fingers over the gears, and he discovers that a splinter from the wooden platform has wedged itself into the mechanism. He tries to pick it out with his knife, but the splinter breaks, leaving part of it still lodged in the gears. Now his crossbow cranks roughly, each rotation accompanied by a grinding sound that suggests something is about to break. He could probably clear it properly if he had time and light and wasn't in a moving tower, but he has none of those things, so he just keeps cranking, wincing each time the gears catch. Sir Roderick has discovered that his cooking pot helmet doesn't fit properly when he's standing fully upright on this level. The ceiling is just low enough that when he straightens his spine, the pot scrapes against the overhead beams with a metallic screech that makes everyone jump. After the third time this happens, Thomas the thief suggests with remarkable politeness, considering that perhaps Sir Roderick could crouch slightly, or remove his noble helm, or possibly shut up about his tactical observations of the battlefield that he can't actually see from his position anyway. Roderick chooses to crouch, which gives him a hunched, miserable appearance that rather undercuts his claims of aristocratic bearing. You notice the walls are sweating. The wet hides on the exterior are so thoroughly soaked that moisture is seeping through the wooden walls, creating a sheen of dampness on the interior surfaces. This is good. Wet wood burns slower, but it also makes everything slippery. The support beams are damp to the touch. The floor is developing slick spots where water has dripped from above, and every surface you might need to grab for stability is now treacherously wet. Medieval engineers understood the fire resistance principle but probably didn't fully calculate the secondary effects of turning their siege tower into a mobile swamp. The tower lurches into proper motion, and the experience is nothing like walking, riding, or any other form of transportation you've experienced. It's a rolling, swaying movement that combines the worst aspects of a ship at sea with the instability of a cart with mismatched wheels. The tower doesn't just move forward. It rocks side to side with each rotation of the wheels, creating a pendulum effect that makes your stomach lurch. You can feel the weight distribution shifting when the tower rolls over a stone. The entire structure tilts slightly in that direction before rocking back. It's like being inside a very large, very slow barrel being rolled down a hill, except the barrel is full of armed men and people outside are trying to set it on fire. Through the gaps in the floor, You can see the level below, and you watch the pushing crew at work. 20 men on each side, hands on long wooden bars that extend from the tower's frame, leaning their full body weight into each push. They're not walking, there's no room for proper steps. Instead, they're shuffling forward in tiny increments, feet barely leaving the ground, shoulders straining against the bars. The rhythm is set by that drummer you heard earlier, a steady beat that's supposed to keep everyone synchronized, but you can already see the coordination breaking down. The men on the left are pushing slightly faster than the men on the right, which is causing the tower to drift off its planned course, which means someone will have to correct, which means stopping and repositioning, which means you're a stationary target for however long that takes. Historians still argue whether siege towers were more valuable as actual assault platforms or as psychological weapons. Some scholars point to successful tower assaults, the Tower of Malregard at Lisbon in 1147, for example, or the multi-tower assault at Acre in 1191 as evidence that these structures could be tactically decisive. Others note that the vast majority of siege towers failed to deliver troops effectively and suggest their real value was in forcing defenders to commit resources to countering them, resources that couldn't be used elsewhere. You're currently experiencing the reality behind both arguments. This tower might succeed or fail spectacularly, but either way, the defenders are definitely paying attention to it. The first arrow strikes the tower about 40 seconds into your journey, and the sound it makes is nothing like you expected. In your imagination, arrows thudded into wood with dramatic impact. In reality, this arrow skitters across the wet hide exterior with a hissing scrape, like a knife being sharpened on leather, before presumably falling away. You didn't see it, only heard it, but everyone on your platform freezes, listening, waiting for the sound that means an arrow has found a gap in the armor. Edward responds immediately, nocking an arrow and drawing his longbow in that awkward horizontal position the low ceiling forces on him. He aims through his arrow slit and looses. The bowstrings snap loud in the enclosed space. You have no idea if he hit anything, no idea if he could even see a target through that narrow opening, but it doesn't matter. The act of shooting back is psychological armor for the rest of you, a reminder that you're not completely helpless in this box. More arrows now, a scattered patter of them striking the tower's exterior. Most skip off the hides harmlessly, but you hear one punch through somewhere, a distinct cracking sound as with splinters. Nobody screams, so it didn't hit anyone, but it means the hides aren't perfect protection. There are gaps, weak points, places where an arrow with enough force and the right angle can penetrate. The Genoese crossbowman is still cranking his weapon, fighting with the damaged mechanism. His face is red with effort, veins standing out on his neck, and you can hear him muttering what sounds like Genoese profanity. The windlass is definitely breaking. You can see fragments of metal falling from the gears, but he keeps cranking because what else can he do? Stop and admit the weapon's useless? Admit he's just dead weight taking up space that could go to someone whose equipment works? Jacques hasn't moved from his corner. His crossbow remains across his knees, unloaded and used. You should probably tell him to at least ready the weapon. But you're not in charge. And besides, what difference does one more barely trained crossbowman make? Martin notices, though, and shuffles over to the Flemish peasant. You can't hear what Martin says, but you see Jacques nod slowly and begin the process of loading his crossbow, hands shaking so badly that he drops the bolt twice before getting it seated properly. The heat is becoming unbearable. You've been in the tower for maybe 5 minutes, and already your gambeson is completely soaked through. Sweat runs down your face, stinging your eyes, dripping off your chin. Around you, every man is in the same condition, faces flushed red, breathing heavy, and the assault hasn't even begun. At this rate, you'll be exhausted before you reach the walls, dehydrated and weak exactly when you need to be strongest. Someone thought to include water barrels on the ground level, but getting water up to your platform would require coordination, passing containers up through multiple levels, and nobody's organized enough for that right now. Sir Roderick has wedged himself into a corner where he can stand nearly upright without hitting the ceiling. From there, he's providing commentary on the assault's progress, despite having no view of anything and no tactical knowledge to inform his observations. "We're moving too slowly," he announces to nobody in particular. "At this pace, the defenders will have time to prepare proper countermeasures." Thomas catches your eye and makes a gesture that suggests what Sir Roderick can do with his tactical assessment, and you have to stifle a laugh because laughing in a siege tower seems insane. But also, what else is there to do? The tower hits a significant obstacle. You feel it through your feet, a jolt that runs up your legs and into your spine. The forward motion stops abruptly, throwing everyone toward the front wall. Edward manages to catch himself, but his arrow goes wild, shooting through the slit at completely the wrong angle. The Genoese crossbowman slams into you, and you both hit the wall hard enough that you see stars. When your vision clears, you realize the tower is tilting not dramatically, but enough that the floor is no longer level. You're standing on an incline now, maybe 5 degrees, and that means one of the wheels has sunk into something or broken or found a pit that the scouts missed. Below, you hear shouting. The pushing crew is trying to rock the tower free, throwing their weight against the bars in unison, but the tower isn't budging. You're stuck, immobile, and outside those wet hides, defenders are almost certainly taking aim at a stationary target that's just made itself incredibly easy to hit. The arrows come in earnest now, and suddenly you understand the difference between harassment fire and a coordinated volley. What had been scattered shots, individual archers taking opportunistic potshots at the tower, transforms into a sustained barrage that sounds like heavy rain on a thatched roof. Except this rain is specifically designed to kill you. The wet hides covering the tower's exterior absorb most of the impacts with dull thuds, but every 5th or 6th arrow finds something else: wood, rope, metal fittings, and those hits come with sharper cracks that make everyone flinch. One arrow punches through the hide about 3 feet from your head, the iron point emerging through the interior wall with enough force that it vibrates like a tuning fork. The shaft protrudes into the tower's interior by maybe 8 inches, quivering there at eye level, and you can see the fletching outside through the hole it's created. This goose feather, gray and white, beautiful in an abstract way, and you're mesmerized by it for a moment before realizing that beautiful arrow was intended for your skull. The hole it's made lets in a thin beam of sunlight and, more importantly, gives defenders outside a perfect aiming point. If they can put one arrow through there, they can put more. Edward sees the problem immediately. He yanks the arrow free, pulls out with a wet sucking sound, and stuffs the hole with a piece of cloth torn from someone's cloak. It's not a perfect seal, but it blocks the light, removes the aiming reference, and maybe adds one more layer between you and the next arrow. The English longbowman has done this before. You can see it in the practiced efficiency of his movements, the way he's already scanning for other penetrations, other weak points that need immediate attention. The tower is still stuck, tilted at that 5-degree angle that makes everything harder. Standing requires constant adjustment of balance, and anyone trying to aim through the arrow slits now has to compensate for being on a slope. The Genoese crossbowman finally gets his weapon cranked, the mechanism screaming in protest the entire time, and moves to take a shot, but the angle's wrong. His arrow slit faces slightly upward now instead of straight ahead, which means he's aiming at sky rather than battlements. He curses, tries to adjust his stance, nearly loses his footing on the tilted floor, and you watch him make the calculation that taking a shot from this position is useless. Below, the pushing crew is still trying to free the wheel. You can hear the drum beating a different rhythm now, faster, more urgent, and the crew responding with grunts of effort that carry up through the tower's levels. Someone's shouting orders, though the words are lost in the general chaos. The tower rocks slightly as they throw their weight against it, backward and forward, trying to work the stuck will free through sheer force. Each rock shifts the floor beneath your feet, making it impossible to find stable footing. Jacques has pressed himself into his corner, making his body as small as possible, as if reducing his surface area will somehow protect him from arrows that can punch through oak and hide. His crossbow is loaded now. Martin saw to that, but Jacques is clutching it to his chest like a child's toy rather than aiming it at anything. His eyes are wide, white showing all around the irises, and he's breathing in short, rapid gasps that suggest panic is setting in. You've seen animals caught in traps with that same look, that same desperate understanding that something terrible is happening and there's no escape. Sir Roderick has abandoned his tactical commentary in favor of self-preservation. He's removed his cooking pot helmet, finally conceding that it's useless, and is using it as a shield, holding it in front of his face with both hands. It's actually not the worst idea. The iron pot might deflect an arrow where his flesh certainly won't. Of course, this leaves the rest of his body completely exposed, but Roderick seems to have prioritized his face above all else. Vanity, even in a siege tower, at least it keeps him quiet. Thomas the thief has found a gap between two support beams and wedged himself into it sideways, minimizing his exposure to any angle of arrow fire. It's a smart position. Actually, the beams provide cover from multiple directions, and you find yourself envious of his criminal's instinct for finding the safest spot in any dangerous situation. He catches you looking and grins, teeth showing white in the gloom. Trick is to make yourself a difficult target, he says, as if imparting professional wisdom. Guards, arrows, don't matter. Always make them work for it. A scream cuts through the general noise, high-pitched and sudden, and it takes you a moment to realize it's coming from above. Someone on the 4th level has been hit. You can't see who or how badly through the gaps in the ceiling, but the scream continues, rising and falling in waves of agony. Other voices join in, shouting for help, for bandages, for someone to do something, and the panic in those voices is contagious. You feel it spreading through your own level. Watch men glancing upward nervously, calculating their own odds of being next. The defenders have found their range now, adjusted for the tower's current position, and arrows are finding more gaps. Another shaft punches through the wall near the ladder, this one angling downward, which means the archers are shooting from the battlements at a height advantage. Basic physics: arrows falling from above carry more force, penetrate deeper. Medieval archers understood trajectory instinctively, even if they couldn't calculate the mathematics. They knew that shooting down at a target gave them advantages beyond just being harder to hit themselves. Edward is shooting steadily now, knocking and releasing in a rhythm that speaks of years of practice. You can't see what he's aiming at. The arrow slit is narrow and his body blocks your view, but he's going through arrows fast. You remember you're supposed to be helping with ammunition and scramble to grab the bundle, pulling out arrows and holding them ready. The fletching is rough under your fingers, the shafts slightly greasy from whatever oil was used to weatherproof them. Edward takes each arrow without looking, his hand reaching back in a practiced motion, fingers closing on the shaft, knocking and drawing in one fluid movement. The Genoese crossbowman has given up on shooting from his original position and is trying to find a better angle. He's moving along the wall, testing different arrow slits, but each one presents the same problem. The tower's tilt has ruined the geometry. He settles on one slit that at least faces generally toward the walls and starts cranking his crossbow again, that damaged mechanism grinding ominously. You wonder how many more shots he'll get before the whole thing fails completely. A historical detail worth knowing. Medieval armies sometimes filled arrows with combustible materials, cloth soaked in pitch, small clay pots of Greek fire, even just wrapped tinder that would ignite from the heat of the arrow's flight through the air. Fire arrows weren't as common as movies suggest because they were significantly less accurate than regular arrows, and the fire often went out before reaching the target. But against a target as large and stationary as a siege tower, especially one you knew was covered in hide and wood, fire arrows became viable. The defenders haven't used them yet, but it's only a matter of time. The tower lurches suddenly. The stuck will has come free, either through the crew's efforts or because whatever trapped it has given way. The sudden motion throws everyone sideways. Jacques goes down completely, his crossbow clattering across the floor toward one of the gaps. You watch it slide, certain it's going to fall through to the level below, but it catches on a slight rise in the planking and stops, teetering on the edge. Jacques crawls after it, undignified and desperate, and manages to grab it before it falls. The tower is moving again, but the tilt remains. Whatever freed the wheel didn't fix the underlying problem. One side is still sinking more than the other, or one wheel is damaged, or the ground is simply too uneven. Every rotation of the wheels rocks the tower more pronouncedly now, a swaying motion that makes standing difficult and aiming nearly impossible. Edward has to time his shots between the sways, releasing during the brief moment when the tower is closest to vertical. His success rate is dropping. You can see the frustration building in the set of his shoulders, the tightness of his jaw. Martin has moved to the arrow slit on the opposite wall, the one facing away from the castle, and he's peering out at something. You edge over to see what's caught his attention and glimpse, through the narrow opening, a sight that makes your stomach drop. The field behind the tower is littered with fallen soldiers, men from the pushing crew. You realize who were exposed at the tower's rear and got hit by arrows arcing over the top or finding gaps in the structure. They're not moving, these fallen men, just dark shapes against the churned mud, and there are more of them than you expected. The pushing crew is being whittled down even as they work, which means the tower will slow, which means longer exposure to arrow fire, which means more casualties in an awful feedback loop. A defender's arrow finds Edward's slit, somehow threading the narrow opening at exactly the right angle. Edward jerks back just in time. The arrow passes so close you see it ruffle his hair and buries itself in the back wall with a solid thunk. Edward doesn't even pause. He's already moving to a different slit, repositioning, adapting. But you saw his face in that moment when the arrow passed him, and for the first time the longbowman looked genuinely shaken. The heat is reaching critical levels. The combination of body heat, external sun, and wet hides has turned your platform into a furnace. Men are gasping for air, pulling at their armor, desperate for relief that isn't coming. Someone's vomited in the corner. You can smell it adding to the general miasma. The lack of ventilation means the odor just hangs there, making others gag, threatening a chain reaction of sickness. Sir Roderick has dropped his cooking pot and is leaning against the wall, face alarmingly red, breathing in great wheezing gulps. Heat exhaustion, probably made worse by his earlier exertions arguing about platform space and maintaining his fictional dignity. He's no longer capable of much beyond staying upright, which at least means he's shut up about tactics and nobility and everything else. Thomas eyes him speculatively, thief, probably calculating whether a heat-exhausted man is easier to rob, but even Thomas seems to recognize that survival requires cooperation right now. The drum rhythm from below changes again, speeding up. The assault rush. You realize the final push toward the walls. You're close enough now that the crew is abandoning caution for speed, trying to cross the last stretch of killing ground as fast as possible. The tower's motion becomes more violent, rocking and swaying as the men below throw everything into each push. Through the arrow slits, you catch glimpses of the wall approaching, massive and stone and crowned with defenders who are no longer distant figures but distinct individuals with faces and weapons. An arrow finds flesh on your level, not a fatal hit, but enough. One of the other conscripts, a man you don't know, takes a shaft through his thigh. The arrow must have come through one of the floor gaps from below, angling upward, because it's buried deep in the meat of his leg, point emerging from the top of his thigh. He goes down screaming, clutching at the shaft, and the screaming doesn't stop. Nobody moves to help him. What would they do? Pull the arrow out and watch him bleed faster? Leave it in and let him scream? There are no good options, and everyone is paralyzed by that knowledge. Remember that sweating wall we talked about earlier? The moisture seeping through has now created genuinely dangerous conditions. The floor is slick with water, mixed with blood from the wounded man's leg, creating a surface with absolutely no traction. Jacques loses his footing trying to back away from the screaming soldier and goes down hard, cracking his head against a support beam. He stays down for a long moment, and you think he might be unconscious, but then he moves, slowly sitting up, one hand pressed to his skull, blood seeping between his fingers. The tower has wounded him more effectively than the defenders. The Genoese crossbowman finally gets his shot off. The bolt launches with the distinctive snap thrum of a crossbow releasing, and through the arrow slit you see it arc toward the battlements. You have no idea if it hits anything, but the crossbowman nods to himself, satisfied, and begins the cranking process again. The mechanism sounds worse than before, metal grating on metal, something definitely broken or bent but still functional. How many more shots before it fails completely? 2, 3, 1. Fire arrows come now, and you know them immediately by the sounded different whistle through air, the arrows trailing smoke. The first one hits the wet hide and fizzles out, the dampness doing exactly what it was meant to do. But the second finds a seam where two hides meet, a drier spot, and suddenly there's flame on the tower's exterior. You can't see it from inside, but you can hear its crackling rush of fire taking hold and smell it, acrid smoke beginning to filter through the walls. Someone on another level is ringing a bell, the signal for fire, and you hear people moving, buckets being passed, water sloshing. The tower's fire response is happening, but you have no idea if it's effective because you can't see the exterior. All you know is that smoke is definitely getting thicker, and smoke in an enclosed space is just as deadly as flames. Edward has gone through most of his arrows. You check your bundle and find only 3 remaining. 3 arrows for however much longer this assault takes. And Edward's shooting maybe 1 every 15 seconds when the tower's motion allows it. You do the math, 35 seconds of covering fire left, and then what? Edward becomes just another body taking up space. Another mouth breathing the diminishing air. The tower hits something else. Another obstacle, but this time doesn't stop. Instead, there's a tremendous crack from below and the floor tilts more dramatically, maybe 15 degrees now. Whatever the tower struck has caused structural damage, broken beam, cracked support. Something critical has given way. The tilt is severe enough that men are sliding toward the low side, struggling to find handholds, and the wounded soldier with the arrow in his leg rolls helplessly across the bloody floor until he fetches up against the wall. Through an arrow slit, you glimpse the walls close now, maybe 20 yards away, close enough to see individual stones in the masonry, close enough to see the faces of defenders clearly. They're young, some of them younger than you expected. Medieval warfare didn't discriminate by age for defenders any more than it did for attackers. Everyone who could hold a weapon was on those walls, from grizzled veterans to boys barely old enough to grow beards. The tower shudders to a halt, and for a moment you think it's stuck again. But then you hear its sound of wood meeting stone, a grinding crunch that reverberates through the entire structure. You've reached the wall. The tower has made contact, and now comes the part everyone's been dreading. The drawbridge drop, the mad rush onto the battlements, the moment when this mobile shelter becomes a death funnel. Above you, you hear the mechanism being worked, chains rattling, someone shouting to clear the platform. The drawbridge is about to drop, and every defender on that section of wall is waiting for it, weapons ready, knowing exactly where you'll emerge. The engineering marvel or disaster, depending on your perspective, that is your siege tower, represents centuries of accumulated knowledge about how to build mobile assault platforms that technically work. The keyword being technically. What you're standing in is the result of countless iterations. Failed designs that collapsed during transport, successful designs that collapsed during assault, and a handful of miraculous successes that convinced commanders this was a viable military strategy. The tower swaying beneath your feet embodies both humanity's engineering ambition and its spectacular capacity for creating death traps with academic precision. The basic physics are deceptively simple. Build a wooden structure tall enough to overlook defensive walls, mount it on wheels, push it to the fortification, drop a bridge onto the battlements, and flood troops across. What could go wrong? Everything, as it turns out, and medieval engineers knew this. They just didn't have better options. So they built siege towers anyway, each time hoping their calculations were correct and the gods of structural integrity were feeling generous. Your tower stands approximately 42 feet tall. You know this because someone mentioned it during construction with the pride of an architect describing a cathedral, though this particular monument is dedicated to death rather than worship. The base measures roughly 16 feet square, tapering slightly as it rises to maintain a lower center of gravity. The entire structure weighs somewhere between 8 and 12 tons. Nobody's quite sure because medieval weighing capabilities topped out well below that. So it's an educated guess based on wood density calculations and hopeful assumptions about moisture content. The wheels are the tower's most critical components and also its most likely failure points. Each wheel is 6 feet in diameter, carved from solid oak by craftsmen who understood that a single flaw in the grain could cause catastrophic failure under load. The axles are greased with that rancid ox fat you've been smelling, chosen because it's plentiful and cheap, not because it's optimal. Roman siege engineers used specialized lubricants mixtures of animal fats, plant oils, and mysterious additives that ancient texts reference but never fully explain. Your medieval engineers are working with ox fat and prayers, which tells you everything about how knowledge gets lost between civilizations. The tower's frame employs a post and beam construction that would be familiar to any carpenter building a house, just scaled up dramatically. Vertical posts every 4 feet provide the primary support, cross-braced with horizontal beams and diagonal supports that form triangular patterns, the strongest geometric shape. As any medieval mason could tell you, the triangulation principle was well understood. Gothic cathedrals rising across Europe used the same basic concept. The difference is that cathedral builders had years to perfect their craft and unlimited time to test their designs. Siege tower builders had weeks and one chance to get it right. Historians still argue whether the wet hide covering was primarily for fire protection or arrow deflection, and the answer appears to be both. Inadequately, the hides, usually cowhide, though horsehide or even sealskin were used when available, were layered 2 or 3 deep and soaked in water, vinegar, or occasionally urine, which has fire-retardant properties nobody wants to think about too carefully. The theory was sound. Wet organic material doesn't burn easily. The practice was messier. Hides dried out, developed gaps as they shrank, and added significant weight to an already overburdened structure. One quirky innovation that your tower lacks. Thankfully, some 12th century engineers experimented with mobile roofs over the top platform. The idea was to provide overhead protection for troops gathering before the bridge drop, using a wooden canopy that could be raised or lowered. The mechanism involved pulleys, counterweights, and optimism. The Siege of Tyre in 1187 featured a tower with such a roof. It worked perfectly during testing. Then, on the actual assault, the ropes snapped. The roof crashed down and killed 7 men before the drawbridge even dropped. Your tower's top platform is open to the sky, which means arrow vulnerability but at least no death by innovative roofing risk. The tower's current tilt, now a fairly dramatic 15 degrees, represents a catastrophic failure of ground preparation or will integrity, or both. Medieval armies employed scouts to map approach routes, identify soft ground, and mark obstacles. Someone clearly failed that assignment, or succeeded and was ignored, which happens more often in military contexts than anyone likes to admit. The tilt means the tower's center of gravity has shifted off the base of support, and basic physics suggests that beyond about 20 degrees, the whole structure will simply topple. You're 5 degrees away from that threshold, swaying in a wooden box that's deciding whether to fall over. The drawbridge mechanism above you is a masterwork of medieval engineering that's about to be tested under the worst possible conditions. The bridge itself is a platform roughly 8 feet wide and 12 feet long, thick oak planks bound with iron straps. When folded up, it forms the front wall of the top platform, providing protection for the assault troops. When dropped, it's supposed to land neatly on the enemy battlements, creating a pathway across. This requires precise calculation. The tower must be exactly the right distance from the wall, the bridge must be exactly the right length, and the wall height must match predictions. Get any variable wrong and the bridge either falls short, creating a gap that no one will cross, or overshoots and slides off the far side of the battlements. The dropping mechanism uses a counterweight system not unlike a trebuchet in reverse. Rocks and metal weights are positioned on the platform side of a fulcrum, and when the restraining ropes are cut, gravity does the work. The bridge falls forward, ideally slamming down on the battlements with enough force to knock back any defender's position there. Ideally, in practice, you're hoping the bridge doesn't fall apart mid-drop, doesn't miss the wall entirely, and doesn't kill your own troops on the way down. The mechanism has been tested exactly 0 times under combat conditions, and the first test is happening in the next few seconds. Edward has 1 arrow left, the last one in your bundle, and he's making it count. He's not shooting yet, conserving it for the crucial moment, though what constitutes crucial in a situation where everything is already desperate is unclear. The English longbowman is studying the battlements through his arrow slit, picking his target, waiting for a shot that matters. You respect the discipline even as you wonder if any shot truly matters when you're one man against a castle full of defenders. The Genoese crossbowman's weapon has finally failed. The windlass gave out on his last cranking attempt, gears fragmenting with a sound like breaking teeth. He's holding a very expensive, very useless piece of equipment now, and his face shows the particular frustration of a professional whose tools have betrayed him. He sets the crossbow down carefully, decades of training making him treat the weapon with respect even in failure, and draws a short sword that looks almost comically small in his hands. He's a crossbowman, trained for ranged combat, and now he's reduced to a role he's neither equipped nor prepared for. Jacques has recovered from his head wound enough to be conscious, though blood still runs down his face from the gash on his scalp. Head wounds bleed dramatically even when superficial, and Jacques looks like he's been scalped. He's managed to hold onto his crossbow through everything: the fall, the bleeding, the chaos, and it's still loaded, that one bolt ready to fly. Whether he'll actually shoot it or even knows how to aim properly is another question entirely. Sir Roderick has found a new lease on life now that the tower has stopped moving. The constant swaying was destroying him, but now, tilted but stationary, he's regaining some composure. He's even retrieved his cooking pot helmet and placed it back on his head, though it sits askew at an angle that makes him look less noble and more like a drunk who's lost an argument with his kitchenware. He's gripping his short sword with both hands, knuckles white, blade pointing vaguely forward, ready for combat he has no training for. Thomas the thief has produced a second knife from somewhere on his person where he was hiding it. You have no idea, and now holds a blade in each hand. He's grinning again, that unsettling expression that suggests he's looking forward to the violence ahead, or at least prefers it to the waiting. Criminal experience translates to close combat better than farming or blacksmithing does. Thomas has probably been in more knife fights than everyone else on this platform combined. It doesn't make him a soldier, but it makes him dangerous, which is something. The wounded man with the arrow in his thigh has stopped screaming, which is either Goods dealing with the painter Badas going into shock. He's pulled himself into a sitting position against the wall, both hands wrapped around the arrow shaft, not pulling it out but holding it steady, stabilizing it against further movement. His face is gray, lips pale, and you recognize the signs of blood loss. He's not climbing any ladders or crossing any drawbridges. He'll live or die right there on that platform, and whether anyone comes back for him depends entirely on how the next 10 minutes unfold. A brilliant engineering solution your tower lacks. Some siege towers included internal staircases rather than ladders. The Romans built towers with proper stairs, understanding that moving armed men vertically is dangerous enough without making them climb rungs while carrying weapons. Medieval siege towers occasionally attempted this. The Siege of Antioch in 1098 featured a tower with a spiral staircase that chronicles describe as an engineering marvel. It also made the tower so heavy that it couldn't be moved into position and had to be abandoned, which rather defeated the purpose. Your tower sticks with ladders, prioritizing mobility over safety, because apparently that's the trade-off. The sound from above changes the metallic scraping of the drawbridge mechanism being prepared. You hear men shouting, orders being given, the assault team positioning themselves for the rush. The top platform holds maybe 20 soldiers, all of them about to funnel onto a bridge 8 feet wide while defenders with reach advantage try to kill them. Medieval tactics didn't include sophisticated small unit coordination. The strategy was essentially run at them screaming and hope numbers overwhelm skill. Subtle it wasn't, but when you're crossing a wooden plank 40 feet above ground with arrows coming at you, sophistication takes a back seat to speed and aggression. Martin has pressed himself against the ladder leading up, ready to climb when the order comes. You're not clear on whether your level is supposed to ascend and join the assault or stay put and provide covering fire, but Martin's apparently decided on his own initiative. The supposed veteran is breathing hard, hands flexing on his weapon, and you realize he's just as terrified as everyone else. Whatever experience he claims hasn't prepared him for this, or maybe it has, and that's exactly why he's terrified, knows what's coming. Through the arrow slits, you glimpse defenders massing at the point where the bridge will drop. They're not panicking, not running. They're organizing, forming ranks, presenting a wall of spears and shields and grim determination. These men have defended this castle before, probably against siege towers just like yours. They know the drill. Let the bridge drop, weather the initial rush, then methodically kill everyone who crosses until the assault breaks or the bodies pile up enough to block the bridge. It's a proven strategy, and they have the advantage of position, preparation, and protection. The tower shudders again, and for a heart-stopping moment you think it's tipping, finally going over, but it's just settling. The tilt increases marginally, maybe 16 degrees now, and you hear wood groaning under stress loads it was never designed to handle. Medieval engineers understood compression and tension forces in general terms, but calculating stress distribution in a tilted structure exceeded their mathematical capabilities. They knew it was bad. They just couldn't quantify how bad. Edward takes his last shot. He doesn't announce it, doesn't make it dramatic. He just draws, aims through that narrow slit during a brief moment of relative stability, and releases. The arrow vanishes through the opening, and you have no idea if it found a target. Edward lowers his bow and draws his own short sword, transforming from archer to infantry in the space of a breath. His face shows no fear, no excitement, just grim acceptance of what comes next. The Genoese crossbowman is saying something in his native language, a string of words that sound like prayer or curse or maybe both. He's crossing himself, the gesture quick and practiced, and you realize he's preparing for death with the ritual comfort of his faith. Medieval soldiers were generally religious. Atheism wasn't really an option in a world where the church dominated intellectual life and facing death brought out devotional instincts. You find yourself thinking your own brief prayer, asking God for courage or mercy or at least a quick end if it comes to that. A massive impact from above, the sound of the counterweight releasing, chains running through pulleys, the drawbridge beginning its fall. The entire tower shakes with the force of the mechanism engaging, and then you hear it, the tremendous boom of oak slamming into stone, the bridge making contact with the battlements. It holds, you can tell by the sustained sound. No cracking or splintering, and then the screaming starts. The assault team is going across, and the defenders are meeting them. What follows is sound without vision. The clash of metal on metal, men shouting in multiple languages, war cries and death cries blending into a cacophony that filters down through the tower's levels. You can't see the battle, but you can hear it in vivid, terrible detail. Someone screaming in agony, high-pitched and sustained. Someone else is shouting what might be orders or might be prayers. Steel rings against steel, the distinctive sound of swords meeting shields. Jacques fires his crossbow finally, desperately aiming through an arrow slit at targets he probably can't see. The bolt vanishes into the chaos outside. One more projectile in a battle defined by projectiles. Whether it hits anything is unknowable and probably irrelevant. He's done his part, discharged his weapon, and now stands there with an empty crossbow and no idea how to reload it or whether reloading matters. The order comes, shouted down from above. Second wave. Move up. That's you. Your level is being called to climb, to ascend that rickety ladder to the top platform, to cross that bridge into the killing zone where the first wave is already dying. Martin goes first, scrambling up the rungs with desperate speed. Thomas follows, still gripping his two knives. Edward moves to the ladder, and you realize you're supposed to follow. Sir Roderick is frozen, standing with his sword and his cooking pot helmet, unable to make himself move toward the ladder. His noble pretensions have evaporated, leaving just a terrified man facing death. Jacques is likewise immobile, blood-soaked and concussed and completely unfit for what's being demanded. You reach the ladder and begin to climb, hands slick with sweat on the rungs, the sounds of battle growing louder with each rung ascended. The wounded man watches you go, his face expressionless, and you wonder if he envies or pities you. The top platform greets you with sensory overload that makes everything you've experienced so far seem like peaceful preparation. The sounds you heard filtering down through the tower's levels were muffled, distant, almost abstract. Up here, they're immediate and visceral. The wet thud of blades finding flesh, the scrape of boots on wood, the particular high-pitched ring of steel hitting steel that hurts your ears. The air tastes like copper and smoke, and your first breath on this level makes you gadgets thick with things lungs weren't meant to process. The platform is maybe 12 feet square, and it's crowded with living men, dying men, and a few who've already crossed that threshold into corpses. The assault team Watts left of itis pressed against the drawbridge entrance, trying to force their way across while defenders on the battlements push back. It's not organized combat. It's a meat grinder operating at the interface between tower and wall, grinding up anyone caught in the mechanism. The drawbridge itself is working exactly as designed, which means it's a barely controlled disaster. The oak planks, each one 4 inches thick, have slammed down onto the battlements with enough force that you can see cracks radiating from the impact points. The bridge is wide enough for 2 men shoulder to shoulder, as advertised, but that assumes those men are calmly walking across rather than fighting for every inch while people try to kill them. In practice, it's a single-file death march because anyone who tries to fight side by side just crowds their partner into a blade. The defenders have positioned themselves brilliantly. They're not at the immediate edge where the bridge landed that would expose them to the initial impact and the rush of fresh troops. Instead, they're set back maybe 6 feet, far enough that anyone crossing the bridge has to step fully onto the battlements, find their footing on stone that's slick with God knows what. and orient themselves before the defenders engage. Those 6 feet are a killing ground where confused attackers stumble into organized defenders who've been waiting for exactly this scenario. Remember when we talked about the tower's tilt? It's affecting the bridge angle in ways that make everything worse. The bridge should be level, creating a straight pathway from platform to battlements. Instead, it's tilted downward at maybe 10 degrees, turning it into a ramp that attackers have to charge up while fighting gravity and defenders simultaneously. Medieval engineers could calculate angles in theoretical situations, but accounting for structural failure mid-assault wasn't in their skill set. The tilt also means the bridge is torquing twisting slightly along its length, creating uneven footing that's already caused at least one attacker to stumble and fall off the side. The first wave of assault troops is largely gone. You count maybe 5 still standing on the battlements, surrounded by defenders, fighting with the desperation of men who know retreat is impossible. 3 bodies lie on the bridge itself, obstacles that subsequent attackers have to climb over or push aside, which disrupts momentum and creates perfect targets for defender spears. 2 more bodies have fallen off the bridge entirely. You can see one hanging from the battlement edge by his armor, caught on a merlin, swaying like a grotesque decoration. Martin has already crossed. You watch him step onto the bridge, weapon raised, and he makes it 3 steps before a defender's spear takes him in the shoulder. He doesn't fall credit to him. He keeps his footing, but he's wounded, bleeding, and now trying to fight one-handed while keeping his balance on that tilted, blood-slick surface. The spearman withdraws his weapon for another thrust, and Martin does the only thing he can, charges forward, closing the distance, trying to get inside the spear's reach where his short sword becomes useful. Thomas the thief crosses next, and his criminal experience shows immediately. He doesn't charge straight across like the soldiers. He moves in a crouch, making himself a smaller target, using the bridge's raised edges for what minimal cover they provide. A defender swings at him. You see the blade arcing down, and Thomas rolls on the bridge, comes up on one knee with his knives out, and stabs upward into someone you can't see. There's a scream, a spray of blood, and Thomas keeps moving, disappearing into the chaos on the battlements. Edward is waiting his turn, positioned at the bridge entrance, and you realize he's not rushing across. The longbowman is watching, calculating, waiting for an opening in the melee. He's fought on walls before. You can see it in his tactical patience, and knows that charging blindly into packed combat is suicide. He's looking for a gap, a moment when defenders are distracted, an angle of approach that doesn't end with immediate impalement. You're next in line, standing on this platform with the bridge right there, and the simple act of stepping onto it seems impossible. Your legs don't want to move. Your brain is screaming that crossing that bridge is certain death, listing all the ways you'll die. Spear through the chest, sword across the throat, arrow from some defender you never see, or simply losing your footing and falling 40 feet onto the rocks below. The paralysis is complete, a full body shutdown of voluntary movement. Someone shoves you from behind, not maliciously, just the pressure of men trying to get to the bridge. The queue moving forward because standing still isn't an option. You stumble onto the bridge's first plank, and suddenly you're committed. Your feet are on the oak. The battlements are ahead, and retreat would require fighting through the press of men behind you, which is harder than going forward. So forward it is. The bridge surface is worse than you imagined. The oak planks are soaked blood, definitely, but also other fluids you can't identify and don't want to. Someone's lost control of their bowels, either from fear or death, adding another layer of treacherous slickness. Your boots find no purchase. Each step is a controlled slide, and you're walking with your arms out for balance like a child learning to walk on ice. 3 steps in, you have to navigate the first body. It's lying crossways on the bridge. A soldier from the first wave with a spear wound in his belly that's still leaking. You can't step over him, the bridge is too narrow, and you'd lose your balance, so you have to step on him. Your boot lands on his chest, and there's give, the rib cage compressing under your weight, and you feel ribs cracking through your soul. The body shifts beneath you, threatening to roll, and you quickly step to his head, using it as a stepping stone, trying not to think about the wrongness of it all. Halfway across now, and you can see the defenders clearly. There are maybe 10 of them packed into the immediate area, and they're not the rabble you'd hoped for. These are experienced soldiers, probably the castle's garrison, men who've trained for exactly this scenario. They're working as a unit, front rank with shields and spears, second rank with swords ready to exploit any opening. Their positioning is perfect, their spacing coordinated, and they're not panicking despite the press of attackers. This is their castle, their wall, their home ground, and they're defending it with professional competence. One defender makes eye contact with you, actually locks eyes across the bridge, and you see recognition in his face. Not recognition of you specifically, but recognition of what you are. Another attacker, another target, another body to add to the pile. He's younger than you expected, maybe 20, with a scar across his cheek that suggests this isn't his first siege. He's holding a spear, and he's adjusting his grip, preparing for your arrival. Edward moves past you on the bridge, somehow finds room to squeeze by, and you realize the longbowman has spotted his opening. A gap has appeared in the defender line where Thomas's attack pulled someone out of position, and Edward is moving to exploit it with the same practiced efficiency he showed with his bow. He flows across the remaining bridge length, not running but moving in a controlled rush that maintains balance while building momentum. He hits the battlements, sword already swinging, and engages a defender before the line can close the gap. You're almost across, just the final 6 feet, and the young defender with the scar is waiting. His spear is leveled at your chest, and the mathematics are simple. He has reach. You have a short sword that requires you to get close. Charging into a spear point seems like poor tactics, but stopping on the bridge seems equally fatal. The men behind you are still pushing forward, and standing still means getting shoved off the edge. A quirky historical note that's utterly useless right now. Some siege towers included grappling hooks on the drawbridge, designed to catch on battlements and prevent defenders from pushing the bridge away. The siege of Jerusalem in 1099 featured towers with such hooks, iron claws that bit into stone and held fast. Your bridge has no such innovation, relying instead on weight and hope. If defenders coordinate enough to lift or shift the bridge, everyone on it falls, and there's nothing to prevent that except the chaos of combat. The spearman thrusts, and you do the only thing your panicked brain suggests: dodge sideways. There's no room, the bridge is 8 feet wide. You're in the middle, and sideways means empty air, but you do it anyway, throwing yourself toward the edge. The spear point passes so close you feel it tug at your gambeson, and then you're off balance, tipping 1 foot over the edge with nothing but void beneath it. Your other foot catches on something, the bridge's raised edge, a rope railing. You're not sure, and you arrest the fall, windmill your arms, and somehow regain the bridge. But now you're at the very edge, precarious, and the spearman is already recovering for another thrust. He's gonna put that iron point through you, and there's nothing you can do to stop it. Thomas saves you, though he doesn't know it. The thief's assault on the defender line has created enough disruption that the young spearman has to turn, has to address the threat behind him, and that quarter second of divided attention is enough. You rush forward, not gracefully, not tactically, just a desperate stumbling charge, and cover the final distance to the battlements. Your feet hit stone, actual stone, and the change in surface is shocking. After the bridge's wood and its awful slickness, the stone feels solid and real even though it's just as blood-slick. You stumble, go to one knee, and your sword clatters away across the battlement. You're unarmed, on your knees, surrounded by combat, and completely unprepared for any of it. Someone's boot catches you in the ribs, not a deliberate kick. Just someone stumbling in the press of bodies, and you're knocked sideways into the battlement wall. The stone is cold against your cheek, and for a moment you're pressed there, unable to move, while the battle rages around you. You can see through a those gaps in the battlement designed for defenders to shoot through, and the view is dizzying. 40 feet straight down to the ground below, where siege equipment and supply tents and tiny figures of soldiers look like a child's toys. The moment of paralysis breaks when you see your sword, maybe 10 feet away, lying against a merlin. You crawl toward it, dignity abandoned, survival paramount, and somehow navigate through the forest of legs and falling bodies. Your hand closes on the grip just as someone trips over you, a defender who goes down hard, cracking his head on stone with a sound like a melon bursting. You're on your feet again, sword in hand, and the reality of close combat hits you with full force. Training what little you had covered the basics. Thrust, parry, keep your guard up. Reality is nothing like that. It's impossible to see threats coming because there are bodies everywhere, movement in every direction, and your helmet limits your peripheral vision to almost nothing. Someone swings at you, you don't see who, and you block purely by instinct, your sword meeting theirs with a jarring impact that nearly knocks your weapon from your grip. The young spearman has found you again, emerging from the crowd with that spear still ready. Close, you can see he's terrified too. His eyes are wide, his breathing ragged, but his training holds where yours is failing. He thrusts, textbook perfect form, and you do something that's either brilliant or idiotic. You step into the thrust instead of away. The spear point passes under your arm, close enough to scrape your gambeson but missing flesh, and suddenly you're inside his reach where the spear is useless. Your sword comes up, not a trained strike, just a desperate upward slash, and catches him under the chin. The blade isn't sharp enough to cut cleanly. Medieval swords were often barely sharp at all, designed more for stabbing than slicing. But the impact is enough, snapping his head back, and he goes down. You don't know if he's dead or unconscious or just stunned, and you don't wait to find out. The battlements are maybe 6 feet wide, and they're packed with maybe 30 men total, attackers and defenders mixed together in chaotic melee. There's no front line anymore, no organized formation, just individual combats happening simultaneously in a space too small for them all. You see Martin still fighting, his wounded shoulder limiting him but not stopping him. You see Thomas working his knives with vicious efficiency, the thief's street fighting experience translating perfectly to this brutal close quarters work. Edward is methodically working through defenders, his sword technique economical and effective, nothing wasted. More attackers are crossing the bridge now. The second wave is fully committed and the pressure on the defenders is building. They're being pushed back along the battlements, forced to give ground, but they're making you pay for every foot. Bodies are piling up on both sides, creating obstacles that disrupt movement and provide cover. You see one defender using a corpse as a shield, holding the dead man up while stabbing around him. Historians still argue whether medieval close combat was about skill or numbers, and you're experiencing the answer: both, neither. It's complicated. Skilled fighters have advantages: better technique, economical movement, tactical awareness, but in a press this tight, luck matters as much as skill. You're alive right now partly because you made some decent decisions, but mostly because you haven't been in the wrong place when a random sword swing came through. A defender appears in front of you, older man, gray beard, experienced face, and he's got a mace, that flanged medieval club designed to crush armor and the flesh beneath. He swings overhead, putting full force into it, and you raise your sword to block. Bad decision. The mace hits your blade. The superior weight and momentum drive it down, and both weapons slam into your shoulder. Your gambeson absorbs some impact, but not enough. Something cracks bone or cartilage. You're not sure, and your left arm goes numb, dropping uselessly to your side. The gray-bearded defender raises his mace for a killing blow, and you know you can't block it. One arm, sword in hand, and he's going to put that flanged head through your skull. You see it coming, see the arc of his swing, and time does that strange thing where it seems to slow down. The mace never lands because Jacques, timid, terrified, bleeding Jacques, has somehow made it across the bridge and tackles the gray-bearded defender from behind. The Flemish peasant has no technique, no training, just desperate momentum that sends both men stumbling toward the battlement edge. They hit the Merlin together, the defender's mace clattering away, and suddenly they're grappling at the wall's edge where a 40-foot drop waits for whoever loses balance first. You don't help Jacques because your useless left arm and the chaos around you make intervention impossible. Instead, you watch half a second of frozen observation as the two men struggle. The defender has experience and strength, but Jacques has the advantage of surprise and the desperate energy of someone who's already given up on surviving. They're locked together, hands grasping for purchase, feet scrabbling on blood-slick stone, and then gravity makes its inevitable decision. Both men go over the edge, their bodies separating as they fall. Jacques' scream cutting off abruptly when he hits the ground below. Your left arm is responding now, but poorly, a weak tingling that suggests nerve damage or a broken collarbone or both. You try to grip with that hand and get nothing but pain shooting from shoulder to fingertips. You're effectively one-armed in combat, which reduces your already minimal effectiveness to nearly zero. The smart move would be retreat, get back across the bridge, seek medical attention that doesn't exist. But the bridge is still crowded with incoming attackers, and fighting your way back through that press seems harder than continuing forward. The defenders are falling back along the battlements, a fighting retreat toward a tower that rises at the corner of this wall section. It's a strategic withdrawal theory, not breaking, not panicking, just consolidating position in a more defensible location. The tower entrance is narrow, maybe 3 feet wide, creating a natural choke point where numbers become less relevant. If they reach it and hold, they can bottleneck the assault indefinitely, feeding attackers into a killing funnel until everyone's dead or exhausted. Thomas has noticed the same tactical reality and is trying to prevent it. The thief has pushed ahead of the main combat, taking insane risks to cut off the defender retreat. You watch him engage two defenders simultaneously. Knife work that's more butchery than fencing, and he's holding them, blocking their path to the tower. But he's also isolated, cut off from support, one mistake away from being overwhelmed. Edward sees it too and moves to support, but the longbowman has to fight through three defenders blocking his path. His sword technique remains economical, but he's tiring. You can see it in the way his parries are slower, his ripostes less crisp. Medieval combat was exhausting. The weight of weapons and armor, the adrenaline burn, the physical exertion of trying to kill people who are trying to kill you. Even trained warriors could only sustain peak performance for minutes, not hours. Martin is down. You glimpse him through the chaos, sitting with his back against a merlin, both hands pressed to his belly where something dark is leaking through his fingers. The supposed veteran has taken a gut wound, which in medieval terms is a death sentence, not immediate, but inevitable. Battlefield surgery couldn't address internal injuries. Gut wounds meant slow death from infection or blood loss or both. Martin knows it. You can see the knowledge in his face, the way he's stopped trying to fight and is just sitting there, waiting for it to end. Sir Roderick has made it across the bridge. Finally, his cooking pot helmet askew and his sword held like it might bite him. The nobleman who isn't charges into combat with more courage than sense, screaming something about honor and family, and immediately gets his sword knocked away by a defender's shield bash. Roderick stumbles backward, unarmed, and does something surprisingly intelligent. He draws the defender's attention, becomes a target, pulls aggression toward himself and away from other attackers who are actually useful. It's inadvertent tactical contribution. Roderick's just panicking, but it creates an opening that another attacker exploits, putting a spear through the distracted defender. The battlements narrow as you approach the tower, the walkway reducing from 6 feet to maybe 4, and the reduced width makes the press of bodies worse. You're shoulder to shoulder with attackers and defenders alike, unable to swing properly, reduced to stabbing motions and trying not to get pushed off either side. Your one functional arm is tiring, the sword getting heavier with each passing second, and you realize you're operating on pure adrenaline that will eventually fail. A defender appears directly in front of you, young, maybe 16, with terror written across his face that probably mirrors your own. He's got a short sword like yours, and neither of you seems particularly eager to use it. For a moment, you're just two teenagers in armor, wondering how you ended up here, and then training or instinct or sheer necessity takes over. You thrust, he parries, blades scrape against each other with that distinctive steel-on-steel shriek, and you're fighting someone who's exactly as scared and inexperienced as you are. The fight is Uglano technique, no artistry, just desperate hacking. He cuts your arm, a shallow slice that you barely feel through the adrenaline. You catch him in the thigh, the blade biting through whatever cheap armor he's wearing. He goes down, and you step over him, not knowing if he's dead or wounded, not having time to care. Thomas has killed one of the defenders blocking the tower and is engaged with the second, but 3 more defenders are emerging from the tower entrance to support their comrade. The thief sees them coming and makes a decision. He charges the tower entrance, trying to force his way in before they can deploy, trying to bottle them up inside where their numbers mean less. It's tactically brilliant and suicidal, and you watch Thomas disappear into the dark tower entrance with defenders closing in behind him. Edward reaches the tower seconds later, and without hesitation the longbowman follows Thomas inside. You hear combat from within the close confines of a tower stairwell, amplifying every sound, and then silence, which could mean anything. The remaining defenders on the battlements are breaking now, abandoning the wall, retreating into the tower or down interior staircases you can't see. The attackers have won this section of wall, purchased it with how many bodies? You look back toward the siege tower and count corpses on the bridge, on the battlements, hanging from edges. 20? 30? More than that. The arithmetic of medieval warfare was brutal. Attackers typically suffered casualties several times higher than defenders, and breakthrough required willingness to pay that price in human life. Sir Roderick is sitting against the wall, crying. His noble pretensions have completely dissolved, leaving just a broken man in borrowed armor and a ridiculous helmet. He's not wounded, at least not visibly, but he's done, mentally and emotionally finished. When someone suggests he should help clear the tower, he doesn't respond, doesn't even seem to hear, just sits there with tears cutting tracks through the blood and dirt on his face. Your left arm is swelling inside your gambeson, the fabric getting tighter as inflammation builds. You need to remove the armor, assess the damage, but that requires functioning hands and time you don't have. Instead, you just let it hang, useless ballast, and hope it's not broken badly enough to require amputation. Medieval medicine's answer to compound fractures or severe breaks was often amputation. Better to lose a limb than die of infection, and you've seen enough one-armed veterans to know it's survivable but hardly optimal. The tower entrance yawns before you, dark and ominous, and you know you're expected to go in. Clearing a tower means climbing spiral stairs while defenders hold the high ground, fighting upward where they can rain down blows while you struggle to see past your own shield. Tower fights were notorious confined spaces where formation was impossible and individual combat skills mattered enormously. Some castles featured deliberately asymmetric staircases that favored right-handed defenders, making it harder for right-handed attackers to swing effectively. A quirky innovation some towers included: murder holes in the ceiling of the entrance passage. Defenders on the floor above could drop stones, boiling oil, or simply stab downward through these holes at attackers passing beneath. Your tower might have such features. You won't know until you're underneath them, which is exactly the point. Medieval defensive architecture was all about creating lethal surprises. You enter the tower because standing on the battlements seems pointless, and because everyone else is entering, and because stopping means thinking about Jacques falling, Martin dying, and all the other horrors you'd rather not process. The tower interior is dark. After the sunlight, your eyes take seconds to adjust, and the first thing you notice is the smell. Stone and old smoke and something organic that's been rotting in darkness for who knows how long. The staircase spirals up clockwise, which you know from your blacksmith training means this castle was built by someone who understood warfare. Clockwise spirals favor right-handed defenders coming down. They can swing freely with their sword hands, while attackers coming up have their sword arms against the central column, limiting their strikes. It's architectural malice, designing the very structure to kill invaders. Bodies on the stairs. Thomas and Edward's work. You realize, 3 defenders down, sprawled on the stone steps in positions that suggest they died quickly. Thomas is visible further up, still moving, still fighting, which means he's alive and the tower isn't cleared. Edward is nowhere in sight, which is concerning. You climb, favoring your good right arm, sword held low because the ceiling is too close for overhead strikes. Each step is treacherous stone worn smooth by centuries of use, now slick with blood. barely visible in the dim light filtering down from above. Your boots slip, you catch yourself on the wall, and something sharp in the stonework cuts your palm. Minor injury, barely noticeable in the catalog of pain your body is accumulating. A defender appears above, silhouetted against light from a higher floor, and he's got the advantage of elevation and gravity. He swings down at you, a heavy overhead blow, and you can't block it properly with one arm, can't dodge on the narrow stairs, so you do the only thing possible, you charge up into it. The blade catches your shoulder, the already damaged shoulder, and the pain is spectacular, but your momentum carries you into the defender. Both of you go down on the stairs, tumbling, and his head cracks against stone with a sound you'll hear in nightmares if you survive to have them. Thomas is at the next landing, surrounded by 3 defenders, and the thief is losing. His knives are brilliant in open combat but less effective against armored opponents in confined spaces. He's bleeding from multiple wounds, still fighting but clearly fading, and the defenders know Ithiri playing cautious, waiting for blood loss to do their work. You emerge onto the landing and engage the nearest defender from behind. Dishonorable, unfair, absolutely necessary. Your blade finds a gap in his armor at the kidney, and he goes down screaming. Thomas uses the distraction to put a knife through another defender's eye, the blade disappearing to the hilt in the socket, and suddenly it's just one defender against 2 attackers. The last defender raises his hands in surrender, dropping his weapon, and you're faced with a decision medieval warfare posed constantly. Honor the surrender or finish him. Thomas makes the decision for you, stepping forward and cutting the man's throat with casual efficiency. The defender goes down gurgling, hands clutching his severed windpipe, and Thomas wipes his blades on the corpse's tunic without apparent emotion. Edward went up, Thomas says, his voice rough. Haven't heard anything in a minute. That's bad. Silence in a tower fight means someone's dead. And given that defenders had the advantage of position, Edward's silence suggests an outcome you don't want to contemplate. The stairs continue upward, and you can see light at the top, probably an opening to the tower's roof. That's where Edward went, and that's where you need to go, despite every instinct screaming that climbing toward unknown threats with one arm and diminishing strength is the definition of stupidity. Thomas starts up ahead of you, moving more slowly now, his wounds catching up to him. You follow, counting steps because it's something to focus on besides the pain and fear and exhaustion. 15 steps to the next landing, another 10 to the floor above, and then you're at a wooden door, slightly ajar, with light streaming through the gap. Thomas kicks it open and immediately jerks back as an arrow passes through the space where his head was. Someone's still defending this tower, still fighting, and they've got ranged weapons while you're armed with swords and depleting courage. You both flatten against the wall, breathing hard, and you're trying to formulate a plan when Edward's voice comes from beyond the door. Clear! Friendly, coming through. The long bowman appears in the doorway, bow in hand, and you've never been happier to see someone. He's bleeding from a cut across his forehead, and there's an arrow stuck in his thigh that he seems to be ignoring, but he's alive and functional. Roofs secured. Edward reports. 3 defenders, all down. We control the tower. He says it matter-of-factly, like reporting the weather, and you realize this is just another day's work for him. The killing, the climbing, the constant proximity to death. For Edward, this is normal. The tower doesn't burn the way you expect it. There's no dramatic explosion of flame, No sudden whoosh of ignition. Instead, it starts quietly, almost politely, with a thin line of smoke curling up from the siege tower's base that you notice from your position on the castle battlements. For maybe 30 seconds, you're not even sure it's real fire or just steam from those perpetually wet hides finally drying in the afternoon sun. Then the smoke thickens, turns from white to gray to black, and you understand with absolute certainty that the tower is burning and everyone still inside it is about to die. The fire likely started from a defender's successful fire arrow, one of hundreds shot during the assault, that finally found purchase in a seam where the hides didn't quite meet, or maybe in the exposed wood of the wheel mechanisms below. Medieval fire was patient. It didn't need immediate ignition, just a smoldering coal tucked into dry wood, waiting for oxygen and time to transform potential into catastrophe. The tower has been providing both for the past 20 minutes while you've been fighting on the walls, and now the bill comes due. You can hear screaming from inside the tower, but distance and stone walls muffle it into something almost abstract, like the crying of birds rather than the death throes of men. The second platform, your platform, where you spent those eternal minutes before the assault, is probably where the fire reached first, climbing up through the levels via those gaps in the flooring that let you see between levels. Smoke rises, heat rises, and fire follows both, turning the tower's vertical construction into a chimney that draws flames upward with ruthless efficiency. The men still inside have three options, all terrible: stay and burn, jump and probably die from the fall, or try to cross the bridge to the battlements where they'll emerge into combat zones still actively contested. You watch two soldiers make the jump, tiny figures silhouetted against smoke, falling with arms outstretched like they're trying to fly. They hit the ground with impacts you can't hear but can imagine, their bodies crumpling in ways bodies shouldn't bend. One moves afterward, crawling a few feet before going still. The other doesn't move at all. Thomas is sitting on the tower roof beside you, pressing cloth against the worst of his wounds, and he's watching the burning siege tower with the detached interest of someone studying a problem that no longer concerns him. Engineering marvel, he says, voice carrying that edge of hysteria that comes from surviving what shouldn't be survivable. Built it for weeks, pushed it to the walls, and it lasted maybe an hour before becoming a bonfire. Efficient, really. His laugh is sharp and wrong, the sound of a mind processing trauma in real time. Edward is working on his own injuries with the practiced efficiency of someone who's done battlefield medicine before. He's cut the arrow shaft protruding from his thigh down to a stub, leaving the head inside because pulling it out would cause more bleeding, and wrapped the wound with strips torn from a dead defender's tunic. The English longbowman's face shows pain but no panic. This is another problem to solve, another variable to manage. Arrows not in deep, he mutters, more to himself than anyone else. Probably hit muscle, not bone. I can walk on it. Your own injuries are demanding attention that you're not qualified to provide. The left arm is definitely broken. You can feel bone grinding when you try to move it, a sensation that brings bile to your throat. The shoulder wound from the defender's sword is bleeding steadily, soaking through your gambeson in a spreading dark stain. Your cut palm is minor by comparison, but it's your right hand, your sword hand, and the blood makes gripping weapons difficult. You're accumulating damage faster than you can process it, adding injuries to a tally that will either kill you slowly or be treated inadequately enough to kill you eventually. The siege tower collapses with a sound like the world breaking, massive oak beams giving way, the entire structure folding in on itself in stages. The top levels go first. the platforms where assault troops gathered, caving inward and sending sparks spiraling into the afternoon sky. Then the middle sections crumble, the walls bowing outward before surrendering to gravity and flame. The base holds longest those massive support beams and the wheel mechanisms engineered to carry tons of weight, but even they eventually succumb, and the entire tower slumps into a burning heap that barely resembles the structure it was. Historians still argue whether siege towers were worth the investment, the weeks of construction, the resource expenditure, the inevitable casualties. Some point to successful assaults like this one as justification. You've taken a section of wall, penetrated the defenses, and established a foothold. Others note that the same objectives might have been achieved through escalade with ladders, or mining, or simple starvation siege, all of which cost fewer resources if not necessarily fewer lives. You're living proof of the tower's tactical successory on the enemy battlements. After all, but you're also proof of its horrific cost. The castle garrison is responding to your intrusion with organized counterattack. You can hear drums from inside the castle grounds. See defenders massing in the courtyards below. Watch as fresh troops deploy to retake the wall section you've captured. Medieval castles were designed with defense in depth. Losing one wall section didn't mean losing the castle. Interior walls, fortified positions, murder holes, and killing grounds all waited for attackers who thought they'd won by reaching the battlements. Thomas has spotted the same tactical reality. "We're going to die here," he says conversationally, still pressing cloth to his side where a defender's sword opened a long gash. "Took the wall, can't hold it, and the tower's gone, so no reinforcements. Classic military blunder, take ground you can't reinforce." The thief's criminal pragmatism has apparently extended to tactical analysis, and his assessment is probably correct. You're maybe 15 attackers still combat capable, holding maybe 100 feet of wall against a garrison that numbers in the hundreds. Edward shakes his head, checking his bowstring despite having no arrows. Might hold until nightfall. Commander might push more troops with ladders once he sees we've got the wall. Might negotiate surrender. The longbowman is grasping for possibilities, running through scenarios, trying to find the path where some of you survive. Medieval siege warfare did include surrender protocols, ransom for nobles, mercy for commons if the besieging commander felt generous, but there were also massacres where every attacker was killed as an example. Sir Roderick is still on the battlements below, sitting against his Merlin, and from this elevated position you can see he's talking to himself, lips moving in what might be prayer or might be conversation with invisible companions. Combat breaks people in different ways. Roderick's break involved retreating into a fantasy more complete than his earlier noble pretensions. He's no longer useful, no longer even really present, just a body occupying space until someone decides to end him or he simply fades away. The defenders are coming up the interior stairs now. You can hear their boots on stone, their officers shouting orders, the general commotion of troops deploying. They'll emerge onto the battlements you hold, and then it's another melee, another desperate fight, except this time you're wounded and exhausted and they're fresh. The mathematics don't favor survival. A quirky historical detail that's utterly relevant right now. Some castle designs included removable floor sections in wall towers, allowing defenders to isolate parts of the battlements from each other. If attackers took one section, you simply removed the floor connection and turned their captured ground into an island. Your castle tower apparently lacks this feature. The stairs are intact, the connection's solid, but you wish desperately that medieval engineers had been more consistently paranoid about internal defenses. Thomas stands, testing his wounded leg, and draws his remaining knife. He lost one somewhere in the fighting. Die here or die running, he says, presenting the options with criminal clarity. I've run from worse odds. The thief is already eyeing the battlements, looking for escape routes, calculating angles and distances with the same instinct that probably kept him alive through whatever crimes led to his conscription. Edward retrieves his bow, useless without arrows but apparently essential to his identity. We hold, he says simply, held at Crécy, held at Poitiers, hold here. You're not sure if he's referencing actual battles he fought in or just invoking names, but the longbowman's commitment to holding is absolute regardless. He positions himself at the stairwell entrance, sword ready, prepared to sell his life for a wall section that strategically means nothing. The first defender appears at the stairs, and Edward engages immediately efficient strikes. Textbook footwork despite his wounded leg. The defender goes down. Another takes his place, and you realize this is the pattern. Defenders will feed up the stairs one at a time, limited by the narrow passage, and Edward will kill them until he can't anymore. It's attrition warfare at its purest, trading lives until one side runs out. You move to support Edward, though your broken arm makes you nearly useless. Your sword feels impossibly heavy in your right hand, and your grip is weakened by the cut palm that keeps bleeding. Another defender comes up, and you thrust at him more in hope than technique. The blade catches his shield, slides off, accomplishes nothing. He swings at you, and you barely duck the blow. Thomas appears on your other side, knife work replacing your failed sword technique. The thief's blades find gaps in armor, exploit openings, and suddenly you're three wounded fighters holding stairs against a castle full of defenders. It's absurd. It's hopeless. And yet you're doing it because the alternative is sitting down and waiting to die, which somehow seems worse. The siege tower is fully engulfed now, flames reaching 30 feet high, and you can see its glow reflected in the eyes of the defenders you're fighting. The tower was supposed to be your advantage, your technological edge, and now it's a funeral pyre visible from Mylisa Beacon announcing the assault's failure to anyone watching. Future sieges will reference this failure. Engineers will study what went wrong, and commanders will decide whether towers are worth the investment. Your suffering is becoming a case study. Martin is dead. You can see his body from here, slumped against the battlement where you last saw him. The gut wound that killed him probably took 20 minutes of agony, maybe longer, time enough to contemplate every mistake that led to bleeding out on an enemy wall. You wonder if his claimed veteran status was real, if he'd actually survived other sieges, and if so, what made this one the fatal mistake? Medieval soldiers who survived multiple campaigns were both lucky and skilled, but eventually the mathematics caught everyone. The defenders adapt their tactics. Instead of feeding up the stairs one at a time, they wait, building numbers below, and then rush in a group. 6 defenders emerge simultaneously, and suddenly you're overwhelmed. Edward takes 2. Thomas engages 1, and that leaves 3 for you with 1 functioning arm. You block the first strike, deflect the second, and the third catches you in the ribs, a crushing blow that might have broken bones or might have just bruised organs. Impossible to tell through the pain. You go down, and from the ground you see Thomas fall to a sword through his thigh that severs something important because blood spurts rhythmically, arterial bleeding that medieval medicine cannot address. The thief's face shows surprise more than pain. like he can't quite believe this is how his story ends. Edward is still fighting, still killing, but there are too many defenders now, and the longbowman's movements are slowing, his strikes losing precision. The counterattack has succeeded. Defenders swarm the battlement, and the handful of surviving attackers are being systematically eliminated. You watch it happen from your position on the ground, unable to rise, unable to fight, just a spectator to your own defeat. A defender stands over you, sword raised for the killing blow, and you have time to think that dying on a castle wall is better than burning in that tower, which is a low bar for consolation, but apparently where you've set it. The sword descends, and you close your eyes because watching seems pointless, and then there's a horn-a-long, sustained blast from somewhere beyond the walls, and the defender hesitates. The horn sounds again, joined by others, and you recognize the pattern: retreat, withdrawal, disengage. But who's retreating? The defenders or your own side? The defender above you steps back, confused, and through the chaos you hear orders being shouted. The garrison is being recalled, pulled back from the walls to address some other threat. The siege has apparently developed complications beyond this single wall assault, and the defenders are being redeployed. They leave the battlements at a run, leaving wounded and dead from both sides scattered across the stone. Edward collapses against the wall, finally allowing exhaustion and wounds to claim him. Thomas has gone pale, his hands pressed to the thigh wound that's still pumping blood. You lie where you fell, ribs screaming, arm broken, shoulder torn, and you realize you've survived. Not through skill or courage or tactical brilliance, but through sheer random chance, the siege's larger dynamics pulling defenders away before they could finish killing you. The burning siege tower collapses further, sending a fresh plume of sparks skyward, and you watch them drift across the afternoon sky like dying stars. The aftermath settles over the battlements like a fog, and you discover that surviving is just the beginning of an entirely new set of problems. Your body is inventorying its damage with increasing insistence. The broken arm throbs with each heartbeat. The shoulder wound burns like someone's holding a brand to it, and your ribs produce a sharp, catching pain every time you breathe that suggests something's cracked or broken internally. Medieval medicine's approach to such injuries was remarkably straightforward. Set what can be set, stitch what can be stitched, and hope infection doesn't kill you within the week. Your odds of seeing next month are dropping by the hour. Thomas is dying beside you, and he knows it. The arterial bleed from his thigh wound has slowed not because it's clotting, but because he's running out of blood to lose. His face has gone the particular shade of pale that precedes death, a grayish-white that makes his skin look like old parchment. He's still conscious, still aware, and that might be the cruelest perthaving time to understand that you're dying, to feel it happening in real time. Funny thing, he whispers, voice already fading, spent years dodging the hangman, just to bleed out on a wall I didn't even want to climb. His criminal's irony persists even as his pupils dilate and his breathing becomes shallow. Edward has dragged himself over to Thomas, and the longbowman is attempting something resembling battlefield medicine. He's tied a strip of cloth above the thigh wounded tourniquet, though medieval soldiers wouldn't have called it that, pulling it tight enough to cut off blood flow. It might save Thomas's life or might just delay death by a few minutes. But Edward works with the focused determination of someone who needs to do something, anything, to maintain the illusion of control. Stay awake, Edward tells Thomas, though both men probably know it's pointless. Keep talking. Stay present. Don't drift. The castle below is in chaos. You can hear it even from your position on the wall. Horns continue blowing. Officers shouting contradictory orders. Troops moving in patterns you can't decipher from this vantage point. Whatever threat caused the defenders to abandon their counterattack is significant enough to require redeploying the entire garrison. Through gaps in the battlements, you glimpse movement in the courtyards. Soldiers forming ranks, siege equipment being repositioned, civilians running toward what might be shelter or might be assembly points. The castle is preparing for something, and you have no idea whether that something benefits or dooms you. Sir Roderick hasn't moved from his position against the Merlin. From your elevated perspective in the tower earlier, you saw him talking to himself. Now, closer, you can hear fragments of his monologue. He's reciting what sounds like genealogy. And Robert married Catherine of Anjou, who bore 3 sons, the eldest being Henri, who took service with the Duke. A litany of fictional ancestors that provides whatever comfort delusion can offer. His sword lies beside him, forgotten, and dried blood on the blade suggests he actually used it at some point, actually killed someone, which makes his current catatonia seem almost earned. He's broken, but at least he broke after contributing something. You manage to sit up, though the movement sends fresh waves of agony through your ribs and shoulder. The battlements are littered with bodies. You count 23 corpses in the immediate area, a mix of attackers and defenders so intermingled that sorting them would require close examination. Some are clearly dead, sprawled in positions that only death creates. Others might be wounded, might be savable with treatment that isn't coming, might be dying as slowly as Thomas. Medieval battlefields were notorious for this. The wounded left where they fell because retrieving them mid-combat was impossible, and afterward, identifying who was salvageable required time and resources no one had. A quirky historical detail that's grimly relevant. Medieval armies occasionally employed Wound Watchers soldiers whose job was to monitor the injured and determine who was worth saving. They'd move through battlefields after combat, looking for signs of survivability. Conscious wounded got priority. Unconscious but breathing got secondary attention. And anyone who looked too far gone was simply left to die. It was brutal triage based on limited medical knowledge and even more limited supplies. Your siege has no such organization. The wounded are simply scattered across stone, and whether they live or die depends on individual initiative and luck. Edward finally gives up on Thomas's tourniquet. The thief has stopped responding to verbal prompts. His eyes are glassy and unfocused, and his breathing has become irregular long pauses between breaths that keep lengthening. He's going, Edward says quietly, and there's neither emotion nor judgment in the statement, just recognition of reality. Thomas dies maybe 30 seconds later, his last breath a shallow exhale that doesn't get followed by an inhale. Edward closes the thief's eyes with surprising gentleness, a small dignity granted to a criminal who died doing something almost noble. Your attention turns to practical survival. You need water desperately. Dehydration from blood loss and exertion is making your head swim, and you need to address your wounds before infection sets in. Medieval understanding of infection was primitive. They knew wounds could go bad, knew that rot could spread through flesh and kill, but the bacterial mechanisms were centuries from being understood. Treatment involved cleaning wounds with wine or vinegar, applying poultices of herbs that sometimes helped and sometimes accelerated death, and praying to saints who specialized in healing. You have none of these things, just blood-soaked cloth and increasingly poor judgment. The siege tower's ruins are still smoking in the distance, and you can see figures moving around the wreckage. Your own side's troops, probably searching for survivors or salvageable equipment. There won't be many survivors. Tower fires killed quickly either through burns or smoke inhalation, and the collapse would have crushed anyone still inside. You think about the men you shared that second platform with, the ones whose names you never learned, who died before you could know the man. Feel nothing. Emotional processing has been deferred. Right now you're operating on pure survival instinct, and grief is a luxury for people not actively dying. Edward produces a water skin from somewhere, probably taken from a dead defender, and passes it to you. The water is warm and tastes like leather, but it's the most wonderful thing you've ever drunk. You gulp it down, ignoring the pain in your ribs that each swallow produces, and feel momentarily more human. Edward drinks too, rationing himself with the discipline of someone who's been thirsty before, who knows water is precious and overindulgence is wasteful. We're stranded, Edward observes, looking toward where the siege tower burned. Tower's gone. No reinforcements coming up ladders that I can see, and the garrison could return any time. He's cataloging problems with the same methodical approach he used for shooting arrows, identifying variables and calculating odds. Might survive if we can signal our side. Get recognized before defenders come back. The longbowman is already looking for cloth to wave, for a way to communicate across the distance between wall and siege camp. Historians still argue whether medieval commanders valued individual soldiers' lives or viewed them as expendable resources. The truth seems to be somewhere in the middle. Nobles and knights were valuable enough to ransom and retrieve, but common soldiers were largely replaceable. You're a conscripted blacksmith's apprentice. Your value to the commander is minimal, and whether he expends resources recovering you depends entirely on whether it's convenient. The calculus is brutal but honest. You're alive because you survived, but staying alive requires being worth the effort of saving. You hear a voice calling from below the wall your side, speaking French with the accent of the siege camp. Someone's noticed the lack of defenders on this wall section and is investigating. Edward moves to the battlement edge and shouts down, identifying himself, requesting aid. The response is garbled by distance and wind, but the tone suggests acknowledgement. Help might be coming, or at least recognition that there are survivors worth retrieving. Sir Roderick has stopped reciting genealogy and is now Sinjinga wandering, tuneless melody that might be a hymn or might be something he's inventing moment by moment. His eyes are closed, face tilted toward the sky, and he looks almost peaceful in his madness. You wonder what his real story is. Was he ever noble? Or was that always fantasy? Did he have family, a trade, a life before conscription? You'll never know. Roderick's secrets will stay locked in whatever mental space he's retreated to, and even if he recovers enough to speak coherently, you'll probably never see him again. Your broken arm needs setting, and Edward seems to understand basic field medicine. This will hurt, he warns, which is medieval medical understatement. He positions your arm, feels along the break to determine the fracture type, and then pulls a sharp, straight tug designed to realign the bones. The pain is spectacular, a white-hot spike that shoots from shoulder to fingertips and makes your vision gray out. You don't scream, though not from courage. Your throat simply locks up, unable to produce sound through the agony. Edward works quickly, splinting the arm with pieces of wood scavenged from broken arrows and binding it with strips torn from the cleanest corpse he can find. Medieval splinting was surprisingly sophisticated. They understood the need for rigid support and immobilization even without understanding bone healing mechanisms. Your arm is now locked in place at a rough 90-degree angle, which will either heal correctly or leave you permanently disabled. The odds are maybe 50-50, depending on whether the break was clean, whether infection sets in, whether the bones knit properly without modern surgical intervention. The shoulder wound gets similar treatment. Edward packs it with relatively clean cloth, applies pressure until the bleeding slows, and binds it tight. The wound will need proper stitching, but that requires tools and skill neither of you possess. For now, compression will have to suffice, and you'll hope that whatever damage the blade caused wasn't deep enough to sever anything critical. Medieval soldiers routinely survived shoulder wounds. They also routinely lost use of their arms or died from infection weeks later. You're rolling dice with every injury. Movement below ladders appearing against the wall. Troops climbing up from your side. Reinforcements are coming after all, probably capitalizing on the wall section you've captured, trying to exploit the opening before defenders can reorganize. You watch men climb with fresh energy, unburdened by the combat you've endured, and feel a complicated mix of relief and resentment. They're here to help, but they're also here because you did the dying necessary to make this wall section accessible. The first soldier over the battlement is a sergeant you don't recognize, and he takes in the scene with a glance. The bodies, the wounded, the smoking tower ruins in the distance. You held, he says, and it's not quite a question, not quite a statement. Held long enough. He's already directing troops to secure the tower, establish a perimeter, prepare for the inevitable counterattack. You and Edward and the catatonic Roderick are suddenly irrelevant to the tactical situationary yesterday's problem, and the siege has moved on to today's concerns. Edward helps you stand, though standing reveals new dimensions of pain you hadn't fully cataloged while sitting. Your ribs definitely have fractures. Each breath produces a grinding sensation that suggests bone fragments moving against each other. Walking will be an adventure in agony, but staying on this wall means being in the way when combat resumes. So walking it is. You take a step, then another, each one a negotiation with your body about what's possible versus what's necessary. Sir Roderick requires physical assistance to movies not responsive to verbal commands, not really present enough to cooperate. Two soldiers grab him under the arms and haul him upright, and Roderick goes along with the vacant compliance of someone who's stopped making decisions. They'll carry him down the ladders, probably deposit him in a medical tent where someone will eventually determine whether his mind can be recovered or if he's permanently broken. The descent is worse than the climb was. Ladders are precarious when you're healthy, with one arm splinted, ribs broken, and a shoulder wound that started bleeding again. Each rung is a crisis. Edward goes first, moving slowly, favoring his wounded leg, providing a pace you can theoretically match. You follow, gripping the ladder with your good hand, using your legs as much as possible, trying not to think about the 40-foot drop if you slip. Halfway down, your hands slip, sweat and blood making your grip unreliable, and for a heart-stopping moment you're falling. But your arm hooks through a rung instinctively, arresting the fall. The jolt sends fresh agony through your broken arm, and this time you do scream, a raw sound that attracts attention from troops below. Hands reach up to steady you, guide you down the remaining rungs, and then you're on solid ground for the first time in what feels like days but has probably been hours. The siege camp is organized chaos, wounded being triaged. troops forming up for additional assaults, commanders arguing over tactics while clerks record casualties and expenditures. You're directed toward a medical tent, a canvas structure that looks far too small for the number of wounded that will eventually fill it. Inside, the smell hits you first. Blood and infection and the particular sweetness of gangrene that medieval doctors couldn't prevent and could barely treat. A surgeon examines your injuries with the practiced detachment of someone who's seen worse. He confirms the broken arm is set adequately, checks the shoulder wound and declares it survivable if it doesn't rot, and probes your ribs with fingers that send stars across your vision. Cracked, maybe broken, he announces. Can't do much for ribs except bind them tight and hope you don't puncture a lung. Medieval rib treatment was exactly that, simply mobilization and prayer. You're given wine cut with water for pain. Medieval anesthesia was essentially alcohol and hope, and directed to a corner of the tent where you can rest while more critical cases are addressed. Edward is beside you, receiving similar treatment for his leg wound, and the longbowman's assessment was correct. The arrow hit muscle, not bone, and the wound is painful but not crippling. He'll walk with a limp for weeks, maybe months, but he'll walk. The surgeon moves on to other patients, and you're left in your corner, watching the tent fill with wounded from the continuing siege. Some injuries are spectacular: men with limbs hanging by tendons, faces destroyed by mace impacts, bellies opened by swords. Others are subtle internal injuries that will kill in hours or days, infections brewing in wounds that look minor now but will turn septic. Medieval battlefield medicine saved perhaps 1 in 3 serious casualties. The rest died from blood loss, shock, infection, or the crude interventions that passed for surgery. You think about Jacques, falling from the battlements, his scream cutting off when he hit the ground. You think about Martin, dying slowly from a gut wound while combat raged around him. You think about Thomas, bleeding out with criminal irony on his lips. You survived, they didn't, and there's no justice or logic to the distribution, just chance. Just the random chaos of combat deciding who lives and dies. Night falls, and the tent darkens except for a few lanterns that create pools of yellow light. The sounds of the siege continue outside: distant drums, shouted orders, the occasional scream, but inside the tent there's a strange quiet. Men dying don't usually scream. They slip away with whimpers or silence, and the absence of noise becomes its own kind of presence. Edward is asleep or unconscious, hard to tell which, and you're left alone with your thoughts, which is dangerous. Your mind keeps returning to the tower, to the climb, to the bridge, replaying moments and questioning decisions. Could you have saved Jacques? Should you have helped Martin? Was there a better way across that bridge? A smarter approach to the combat? A tactical choice that would have changed outcomes? The questions are pointless, the past is fixed, and second-guessing serves no purpose, but they persist anyway. A mental loop you can't escape. A priest moves through the tent, offering last rites to those who want them and benedictions to those who might survive. He reaches you, and without asking, he blesses you with a murmured Latin prayer and a cross traced in the air. Medieval soldiers were religious almost by necessity. Facing death regularly made the promise of afterlife more than theoretical. You're not sure what you believe, but the priest's presence is oddly comforting. A reminder that some people still care about souls even in a place dedicated to destroying bodies. You drift into something that might be sleep or might be unconsciousness. The line is blurry when you're this injured and exhausted. Your dreams, when they come, are fragmented replays of the day. The tower swaying, arrows striking wet hides, Jacques' face as he fell, the bridge tilting under your feet, the young defender's eyes before you killed him. The dreams have no narrative, no resolution, just images and sensations that replay without meaning. You wake to dawn light filtering through canvas, and you're still alive, which is surprising. Your injuries haven't improved, if anything. The broken arm throbs worse, and the shoulder wound has soaked through its bandages, but you're conscious and breathing, which puts you ahead of some. Around the tent, maybe a third of last night's wounded are still alive. The rest have been covered with blankets or removed, and fresh wounded are already arriving from whatever overnight assaults continued while you slept. Edward is awake, staring at the tent ceiling with the blank expression of someone processing trauma. "We did it," he says eventually. "Took the wall, held it long enough, did our part." He's trying to find meaning in the violence, trying to frame the day's events as achievement rather than horror. Maybe he's right. Maybe capturing that wall section mattered strategically, altered the siege's outcome, justified the cost in lives. Or maybe it was just another day of medieval warfare, where men died for incremental gains that would be forgotten by history. A messenger arrives at the tent, calling for survivors of the tower assault. You and Edward exchange glances. Neither of you is fit for combat, but apparently someone wants to talk to you. You help each other stand, a comedy of cripples supporting each other, and follow the messenger through the siege camp toward the command tent. The commander is a noble whose name you don't know, surrounded by maps and advisors, and he barely glances at you when you enter. "The tower assault succeeded," he announces, like he's surprised. "Wall section secured, tower captured, defenders demoralized. Good work." The praise is perfunctory, probably obligatory, and you realize this debriefing is really about confirming what happened so clerks can record it for reports and history. You're asked questions: how many defenders? What resistance levels? Structural details of the tower, and you answer mechanically, describing events that already feel distant despite happening yesterday. Edward provides tactical observations, noting defender positions and response times, details that might matter for future assaults. The commander nods along, interested but not particularly engaged, and you understand that to him, you're just data points, sources of information about whether his strategy worked. The debriefing ends, and you're dismissed with vague promises of payment for service and medical care for wounds. Medieval armies did sometimes compensate wounded soldiers, especially after successful campaigns, but the amounts were minimal and payment was unreliable. You'll probably receive a few coins, maybe some bread, perhaps a letter confirming your service if you're lucky. It's not much compensation for a broken arm and psychological scars, but it's more than many get. Outside the command tent, you and Edward stand in morning sunlight, and the siege continues around you. Troops forming up, trebuchets being loaded, engineers examining walls for weak points. The tower assault you survived is already yesterday's news. Today brings fresh challenges and fresh casualties, and the siege machine grinds forward regardless of individual suffering. "What now?" Edward asks, and it's a genuine question. You're both too injured for immediate combat, but not injured enough for discharge. The siege could last weeks or months, and you'll be expected to contribute somehow once you've healed sufficiently. If you heal sufficiently, infection could still claim you. Your arm might never work properly, Your ribs might have caused internal damage that will kill you slowly. You don't have an answer. You're alive, which seemed impossible on that burning bridge yesterday. But survival has just delivered you to a new set of impossible situations. The siege continues, your body is broken, and whatever comes next will probably be just as terrible as what came before. But you're breathing, standing in sunlight, and for now that's enough. The wind picks up, carrying smoke from cooking fires and the lingering smell of the burned siege tower. You close your eyes, feel the warmth of sun on your face, and allow yourself a moment of simple existencino combat. No decisions, no terror, just breath and heartbeat and the small mercy of being alive. Tomorrow will bring fresh horrors they always do in siege warfare. Commanders will plan new assaults. Engineers will build new towers or rams or whatever implements of destruction seem promising. Men will die in equally terrible ways, and you might be among them if infection takes hold or if you're forced back into combat before you're ready. But that's tomorrow's problem. Tonight, you'll rest in whatever shelter you can find, eat whatever food is available, and try not to dream about bridges and falling bodies and young defenders whose eyes showed the same terror you felt. You'll inventory your wounds, calculate your odds, and make whatever peace you can with the fact that you survived when so many didn't. Medieval warfare had no therapy, no counseling, no recognition of psychological trauma. Soldiers who survived battles were expected to simply continue, carry their memories and scars without complaint, function despite having experienced horrors that would break most people. You'll do the same because there's no alternative, because stopping means dying, because the siege requires warm bodies and yours is still warm enough to be useful. Edward claps you on the shoulder, the good shoulder, mercifully, and offers a grim smile. We lived through a day in a siege tower, he says. Not many can say that. It's true. Technically, most people who enter siege towers don't leave them alive. You've joined an exclusive club of survivors, united by shared trauma and improbable luck. You nod, unable to find words that capture the complexity of surviving something that should have killed you. The siege tower is gone, burned to ash and broken timber, but its memory remains, carved into your body and mind with the permanence of scars. You'll carry it forward into whatever comes next. This weight of experience that's too heavy to forget and too terrible to fully remember. The sun climbs higher, burning off morning mist, and the siege camp comes fully alive with activity. Somewhere, engineers are already planning the next tower, learning from yesterday's failures, incorporating new designs that might work better or might fail just as spectacularly. The siege's machinery turns, grinding men into casualties and casualties into statistics, and you're just another data point in its endless calculations. But you're a living data point, still breathing despite everything, and that has to count for something. You take a step toward the medical tent, then another, Edward beside you, two survivors limping toward whatever healing medieval medicine can provide. Behind you, the castle walls stand unchanged, indifferent to the blood spilled trying to breach them. Ahead lies pain and uncertainty and the slow struggle of recovery. You keep walking, because walking means living, and living broken, traumatized, scarred though you are is still better than the alternative. The siege continues, with or without you, and somehow, impossibly, you continue too.